This video continues with Chapter 80, 1-3 Jiang's Remarks. Marvel, the Imposter Inventor. Chapter 80, 1-3 Jiang's Remarks. Chapter 80, 1 Sanjiang's speech. It's not actually a personal reflection, but a book recommendation. The main problem is that I don't know what to say on Sanjiang. I used to look down on all books when I read them, always thinking, what kind of trash are these? How can they be published in the Three Rivers Journal? Now I've discovered that even trash like me can get onto the Sanjiang list, and I'm probably the worst one out of a bunch of trashy books. So I really don't know what to say or what to say. However, I promised a few friends I'd help promote their books on Sanjiang, so I should get back to work. Push books. 1. Landing in Sumeru. My stats are fine. This is a relatively niche Genshin Impact fanfiction on Gideon, featuring a rare perspective from the god's point of view. It's a high-quality book with over 3,000 words and currently has 1.6 million words available. If you're interested, you can check it out. 2. Football. I was only 16 when I retired and came back to play. An experienced author, worth following. 3. High martial arts. Fists that shake mountains and rivers. I have a rating panel. Transmigrating to a high-level martial arts world, I have a rating panel with combat and cultivation ratings. As my rating increases, I become stronger, embarking on a path to the top. 4. 1983. A literary giant who abandoned art for literature. After failing his audition for the TV series Dream of the Red Chamber, Lee Yaosi decided to start writing novels. Beginning with returning to one's roots, he gradually climbed to the pinnacle of the literary world. Well, I don't have many friends, so that's all the book recommendations I have. You can check them out if you're interested. That's all. End of this chapter. Chapter 82, Who Are You? Chapter 82, Who Are You? After dismissing the wrench, Luca carried the still sulking Haro back to the underground laboratory. Having collected so many core components, again today, Luca naturally wants to synthesize them as soon as possible. Moreover, as he explored his own cheat code more and more deeply, he had long since prepared a lot of mini and small series of synthetic consumables at home based on his guesses. Fortunately, the materials needed for these items weren't particularly special, so Luca didn't need to spend time waiting for his men to collect the new items. 2 consecutive attempts to create a magic circle synthesis item. The voice changer bow tie and transformation watch are now fresh off the press. However, when it came to the Anesthesia Watch, Luca hesitated for a moment but did not immediately synthesize it. It's not that he's planning to give up the item and return it to Gwen from that parallel world. This is, after all, part of the Conan set, and he said he would never give it up. However, considering that he still planned to communicate with the original owner of the item later, Luca, who had not yet collected 5-5, was not in a hurry. Speaking of which, Gwen is really a lucky charm. I actually got both of these watches from her. Of course, temporarily suspending synthesis doesn't mean Luca has nothing to do. I forcibly carried the orange hello, which was spinning around in the corner, back to the desktop. Luca decided to have the little guy help him analyze the situation and see if he could figure out the specific formula for the spider web liquid. Indeed, Luca had always felt that the sticky liquid in his pencil missile was somewhat similar to Spider-Man's web liquid. However, in this world, Peter Parker is still a little kid even younger than himself, and hasn't even embarked on the path of Spider-Man yet. Without even a reference target, Luca could only ask Haro for help to modify the pencil missile into a handheld missile launcher loaded with gunpowder missiles. Now that Gwen has willingly handed over the spiderweb liquid to him, Luca naturally wants to try to restore and recreate the original pencil missile. The command here is to analyze the proportions using orange Harlow. Luca himself picked up 2 newly made props and started testing them. As expected, the gadgets in Detective Conan are the most shady. Looking at the program code he had copied from the voice-changing bow tie chip on the computer screen, Luca could only shake his head helplessly. The reason this thing is called black is not because the program code inside is so complicated. In fact, even someone as mediocre as Luca could understand the logic behind the code. But it is precisely because of this that the voice-changing bow tie seems even more outrageous. Damn it, isn't this just a simple voice synthesis software? Where's the analysis module? Where's the voice comparison? How can it just twist a few buttons and produce everyone's voice? Somewhat embarrassed and angry, Luca looked at the red butterfly machine in his hand, simply threw it aside, and picked up the transformation watch again to start uploading data. Chinese letter, Chinese letter. The code inside is now quite complex, and the underlying principles seem much more reasonable. However, aside from figuring out how to upload character models, Luca couldn't understand anything else. Interestingly, Luca discovered 2 character model data stored inside the newly synthesized transformation watch. One of them was a white-haired old man labeled Warden, and the other was an ordinary young man named Bernard who looked rather handsome. What is this? A free gift that comes with the product. Thinking about all this, Luca simply picked up the transformation watch and put it on his wrist, gently twisting the dial according to his own understanding. What was originally just an ordinary analog clock face suddenly flashed with the headshot of that handsome young man. The next moment, streaks of pale blue light immediately covered Luca's entire body and began to flash continuously. A moment later, Luca, who was sitting in front of the computer, was completely covered by the holographic projection and turned into a strange young man wearing a brown jacket who looked a bit dull. This scene startled Haro, who was still analyzing the composition of the spider web fluid, so much so that his program froze. A pair of beady eyes flashed red light as it quickly hopped over to Luca. Luca, Luca, you idiot Luca. Well, Luca's sudden transformation, without warning, actually forced Haro's language system to change. If it weren't for the 0th law inherent in his cheat system, which prevents him from being disturbed by any external factors, Haro would probably be even more confused right now. However, Luca did not immediately respond to Haro in front of him. He just stared blankly at the himself, reflected on the computer screen, feeling an indescribable strange feeling in his heart. Did things really change so easily? At this moment, Luca also noticed that not only his appearance had changed, but even his voice had changed. In fact, there was nothing out of place about it. Filled with a strange feeling, Luca gently reached out and pressed down on Haro in front of him. But even with such a simple handshake, the strange feeling became even stronger. This is because, normally speaking, although Luca is considered to be developing well among his peers, he is not yet an adult, and his height is still a bit shorter than the projected Bernard. The same applies to arm span and hand size. But at this moment, even though it was just a layer of holographic projection covering Luca's body, there was no sign of clipping when he grabbed and covered Haro. Instead, it was as if Luca had truly grown taller and bigger in an instant, and he genuinely held Haro in his hands. So, what is this? Does it have an invisible force field, or is it a projection that distorts reality? Filled with doubt, Luca used his right mechanical arm to forcefully snap the corner of the table. A click sound. The wooden corner of the table broke off with a sound. The robotic arm still has its capabilities, but damn, how did they manage to create such clear fingerprints with a projection and a robotic arm? Yes, it was clearly a broken corner of the table from a robotic arm that covered the projection, but a thumbprint was clearly visible on it. Moreover, Luca knew perfectly well that these were not his own fingerprints, but rather the thumbprint of this guy named Bernard. So this really is a transformation technique. If that's the case, then if I scanned a primary school student's body data and covered myself with it, wouldn't I be able to squeeze into a tunnel that my original size couldn't fit into? If anyone can transform, then can giants do it too? What about Ant-Man? In that instant, countless ways to use the transformation watch flashed through Luca's mind. However, just as he was preparing to continue his in-depth research, outside the underground laboratory, footsteps and Samira's shouts could be heard. "Young master, that girl is awake. Who are you?" End of this chapter. Chapter 83, The Origins of Spider-Gwen. Chapter 83, The Origins of Spider-Gwen. Samira's exclamation startled even Luca. "It's me." As he spoke, Luca quickly turned the knob on the transformation watch and transformed back into his original form. Seeing this, Samira looked at the watch on Luca's wrist with a surprised expression, then breathed a slight sigh of relief, inwardly blaming herself for making a fuss, and immediately spoke again. "Young master, the girl you brought back has woken up." Upon hearing this, Luca glanced at the clock beside him. Only then did they realize that several hours had already passed just in synthesizing the two new items and testing the transformation watch, and it was now close to midnight. However, after thinking about it, he still said it. "Let's go take a look. How is she doing now?" Upon hearing Luca's question, Samira's expression turned slightly strange, but she still answered immediately. Big White's test showed that her physical condition has stabilized, but she doesn't seem to be in good spirits. Without thinking much of it, Luca quickly went upstairs to Gwen's room. However, upon closer inspection, he understood what Samira meant by not feeling well. Inside the room, Gwen, who seemed to be from another dimension, was covered in bandages and was lying obediently on the bed. However, the other person's eyes were very blank, and she just stared quietly ahead. She didn't even react when Luca entered the house. Seeing the other party's appearance, Luca asked Big White, who was standing next to him, with some confusion. "Big White, what's wrong with her right now?" The patient's condition has stabilized. Currently, the neurotransmitter activity is low, but still within the normal range, and there are no serious sequelae, Big White's mechanical voice quickly replied. Upon hearing this, Luca took 2 steps forward and stood in front of Gwen, momentarily at a loss for words. Ultimately, Luca chose to bring her back simply because of her identity as Spider-Gwen. Even he himself doesn't know how to deal with the other party now. Well, the reason we attacked you earlier was because we mistook you for a robber. You didn't have a phone or ID on you afterward. Now that you're awake, I can help you contact your family to take you home." Although he said he would contact his family to take him back, Luca was already convinced that this person was from another world. He was only saying this to try and get information out of the other person and find out how this guy got to this world. However, after hearing Luca's words, the girl in front of him only stiffly turned her head to look at Luca for a moment before turning back blankly, without saying a word the whole time. Could it be that Haro damaged its brain? That little thing is truly wicked. Seeing that the other party was not cooperating, Luca, who was so quick to shirk responsibility, simply turned to Samira and said something. "Aunt Samira, could you please step out for a moment?" Samira was somewhat taken aback upon hearing this, but she still obeyed and left the room. And before closing the door, he whispered his instructions. "Young master, I'll be waiting outside. Please call me anytime if you have any questions." After watching Samira leave, Luca casually pulled over a chair and sat down on the edge of the bed. Seeing that Gwen was still silent, he hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Gwen Stacy." Although his tone was questioning, Luca's eyes held an undeniable certainty. As expected, upon hearing this name, Gwen, who had been looking half dead, trembled slightly and quickly turned to look at Luca. Their gazes were now completely replaced by astonishment. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, You know me." Hearing the other person finally speak, Luca, having regained his rhythm, put on his signature smile again. He said it in a light-hearted tone. "Natural cognition." Upon hearing this, Gwen's eyes shone even brighter on the bed. However, Luca's second half of the sentence seemed to plunge him back into despair. "We just met this afternoon." Upon hearing this, Gwen, who had seemed to be expecting something, looked gloomy again. This time, she did not choose to remain silent, but spoke calmly. "I am not her." Although Gwen learned from this conversation that another version of herself existed in this world, such information was of no use to her current situation. In this world without kingpin or particle colliders, she could die at any moment due to the rejection from parallel universes. At this moment, Gwen had already considered giving up. However, Luca spoke again the next moment. "Of course I know you're not her. Tell me, how did you come into this world?" Upon hearing this, Gwen, who had been resigned to her fate, immediately looked at Luca with astonishment and asked incredulously, You know I'm from another world. Is it hard to guess?" Luca wore a mysterious expression, but what he was thinking was, why does Gwen seem a bit slow? Regardless of what Luca thought, in that pull and tug, Gwen, whose emotions were already somewhat out of control, seemed to have grasped at the last straw, wanting only to ask the boy in front of her who knew about the existence of parallel worlds if there was a way to help her return to her original world. However, Luca did not choose to answer her question, but instead asked again, "Tell me first, how did you come into this world?" Now Gwen stopped hiding her feelings and, as if she had found an outlet, poured out her past experiences completely. Having learned the plot in detail, Luca finally understood the other party's origins. Based on Gwen's account and Luca's speculation, this Gwen from another world likely has a similar experience to Ghost Spider-Gwen from the movie Spider-Man, Into the Spider-Verse. In this original world of Gwen, her best friend Peter Parker is transformed into a lizard monster and dies in a battle with her. After that, Gwen was consumed by self-blame and pain. However, not long after, Kingpin from another parallel universe wanted to find his wife and son, so he had his men build a super particle collider that could take people through time. As a result, an accident occurred when the particle collider was turned on. This led her to travel to that timeline, along with several other Spider-Men from different worlds. Ultimately, several Spider-Men, along with Miles Morales who had just become Spider-Man, defeated Kingpin, who had caused the chaos. And with the help of the particle collider built by Kingpin's men, they returned to their original universe. Yes, normally, that's how the story should unfold. End of this chapter, Chapter 84, The Unexpected Signs of a Major Event. Chapter 84, The Unexpected Signs of a Major Event. However, at the very last moment, Gwen plunged headfirst into the space-time tunnel created by the particle collider. Suddenly, a blue light appeared before her eyes. When she came to her senses, she found that she had not arrived in her original world, but in a New York that seemed similar yet was not. At first, although Gwen was somewhat annoyed by her mistake of time travel, she was still trying her best to find a way back. Even though she knew nothing about this world, she still managed to gather a lot of information through her own abilities. For example, there doesn't seem to be a Spider-Man legend in this world. For example, as seen in the news, Kingpin's power in this world has just collapsed. In fact, when Gwen first heard the news, she felt like the sky had fallen. After all, without Kingpin, there would be no particle collider, and she would be unable to return to her original world. However, clinging to the hope that Kingpin was simply gone, and that the particle collider had actually been built long ago, she still chose to go to Kingpin's original territory to investigate further. But the final result was, no, right? Luca gave the answer without hesitation. As far as he knew, Kingpin in this world had never been married, let alone had a wife or children. In this situation, Kingpin would naturally not choose to build a particle collider simply because he wanted to find his dead wife and children. However, as soon as he said this, Gwen paused slightly. Yes, no, I don't know either. Now it was Luca's turn to be dumbfounded. There really is a particle collider. No, Kingpin, a company that's only just begun to develop in this world. What resources would it have to create such advanced black technology? Upon hearing Luca's question, Gwen spoke again. I don't know. I went there following the location of the particle collider in another world, but I only found a similar experimental base. Before I could explore further, the guards there discovered my infiltration. If I hadn't run fast, I might have died there. Upon hearing this, Luca frowned and asked with some disbelief. Did you run into the remnants of Kingpin's forces? No, that doesn't make sense. With your skills, how could a group of ordinary people possibly put you in a life-or-death situation? Gwen shook her head slightly. They are not ordinary people. Most of them are equipped with energy weapons, and there are also a few superhumans and cyborgs among them. I was discovered by a cyborg, and then I was surrounded and seriously injured. Upon hearing Gwen's words, Luca promptly shook his head. That definitely wasn't one of Kingpin's men. If Kingpin had men with that kind of strength, he wouldn't have been killed so easily. That being said, this news only deepened Luca's doubts. When did this new force appear in New York? Cyborgs and superpowered individuals. Luca originally thought that after the Battle of New York would be peaceful for a long time, and other major events would mostly happen in other cities. Only after defeating Kingpin could they continue to develop peacefully in New York. Unexpectedly, this metropolis, where superheroes gather, is indeed a place of trouble, and now a mysterious force has inexplicably appeared. You said there are superpowered people. What are their abilities? What are their characteristics? Luca asked. Cyborgs are obviously mass-produced cannon fodder. Even if you put them in front of Luca, he might not recognize their origin. But with superhumans, there might be some clues to be found. Hearing Luca's question, Gwen didn't choose to hide it and replied after a moment's thought. Several of these superpowered individuals should possess the same ability. Their bodies can emit high temperatures, and they can breathe fire. However, there is one guy who is different from them. That person's ability seems to be the ability to transform his body into various different substances. During my fight with him, I noticed that he simply wiped away some metal that had fallen to the ground, and his entire body turned into a black block of iron. Upon hearing Gwen's answer, a name immediately flashed through Luca's mind. Absorbing people. Gwen, a very descriptive name. Do you know that superpowered person? The Absorber that Luca mentioned is a fairly well-known villain in the Marvel Universe. Its own ability is actually very powerful. It can completely transform its body into the same material by coming into contact with a certain substance. Logically speaking, with this ability, if you give him a vibranium shield, this guy could instantly become a top-tier villain. But perhaps because he wasn't very bright, this villain never thought of carrying any sturdy material with him to use for his transformation. They usually only remember to touch the concrete ground or rubber tires after the game has started, which results in a very poor performance. Otherwise, not to mention carrying a hard-to-find material like vibranium, even if he carried a diamond in his pocket, most superheroes probably wouldn't be able to do anything about him. But if we're talking about absorbing people, I vaguely remember this guy working for Hydra, right? Luca rubbed his temples, feeling a bit of a headache. Unfortunately, while the ability to absorb people was unique, it wasn't a significant person, and Luca genuinely couldn't recall which faction the other party belonged to. As for Gwen's earlier mention of being a fire user, it would be harder to guess if it were a single individual with fire abilities. After all, even dogs wouldn't eat the flame fruit. However, if several beings with the same abilities appeared at the same time, the only one Luca could think of was the Extremis virus, a defective super soldier created by the villain Killian in Iron Man 3. But how did Killian get involved with Hydra 2? The thought of so many troublesome people huddled together, and judging from Gwen's words, it was clearly some kind of dangerous experiment, made Luca's head throb even more. By this time, he was already somewhat regretful for bringing the other person back so rashly. Who would have thought that this guy would get into such big trouble so soon after arriving in this other world? No way. Villains cause trouble. That's for the superheroes to deal with. My small frame probably shouldn't get involved in that kind of danger. With that thought, Luca steadied himself and looked up at the spider girl in front of him again. Actually, if you want to go home, you don't necessarily need to find a particle collider, do you? Even if we find a particle collider, you probably can't be sure you can return to your original world on your own, right? At this point, Luca was actually ready to shout at the ceiling in an attempt to summon the Ancient One. After all, something like parallel world invasion should logically fall under her jurisdiction. Moreover, given that old guy's habit of checking the timeline all the time, he might be able to summon her if I just curse him a few more times. Unexpectedly, before Luca could even attempt to activate his great summoning spell, Gwen pulled out a red USB drive with a spider mark from her chest. Actually, I'm not the only one who strayed into this world. End of this chapter. Chapter 85, Remarks on the Launch. Chapter 85, Remarks on the Launch. It will be available tomorrow. Sorry, I forgot myself. The original plan was to release it this Wednesday. Let me start by sharing some good news, though I'm not sure if it's good or not. I quit my job to write books full-time. Some of you may know that I had been having insomnia for a while. I would go to bed around 4 or 5 in the morning, sleep for 3 or 4 hours, and then get up at 8 o'clock to go to work. I later checked, and it turned out to be mild depression. Actually, I feel pretty good. Apart from insomnia and anxiety, I don't have any other symptoms. The doctor's advice was to not take any medication for now, but to exercise more, play games, and go on trips. After thinking about it, I've been lucky over the years at work. I haven't bought a house or gotten married, but I still have some savings. Even if I do nothing, I won't starve. I might as well quit my job and write novels full-time. Knowing my situation, my supervisor didn't insist on me staying for a full month before leaving or working until the end of the month. After offering some advice and handing over my work, I simply resigned. The reason this is considered good news is that updates to the book should be guaranteed, roughly. Let's get back to this book. What I'm about to say might greatly affect the book's future performance, but it doesn't matter. If it flops, it might even serve as a lesson. To be honest, I think this book is pretty rubbish. It has many flaws, a disjointed pacing, and fails to grasp the main points. There's too little interaction between fan fiction and original characters. The protagonist's personality is awkward, and there are frequent, random, and inexplicable plot points inserted into the story. In short, if I were a reader, I would criticize this book harshly. Even the content I've written has started to deviate from the outline, so I myself don't know how much longer I can continue writing this book. Yes, it was supposed to be a launch message, but it turned out to sound like a declaration of abandonment. I guess I'm the only idiot author like me who does this. Actually, I've thought countless times about just deleting the book and starting over. Yet so many people are still reading this book, and it's even been featured on the Sanjiang Literature City website. I myself spent nearly 3 months on the free period and the initial preparations. All sorts of reasons seem to be telling me to keep writing. For the first time, I felt that writing novels was truly painful. I kept writing my last book until it was finished. Even though it was tiring to work and write at the same time, and I would write on the subway, I kept saying that writing novels was really fun. But this book, it really made me want to die. Please subscribe with caution, everyone. The funny thing is, I said this in the last book when it was already finished and I was writing the side stories. Later on, I might let loose and try a different style, or I might stick to the routine and grit my teeth and keep writing. I don't know what it will be like, or how many words I'll be able to write. All I can say is that if there are still people who like it, I will try my best to keep writing. If I can update 10,000 words every day, I think it won't take more than a few months to finish the story. Just a quick note about the update. I don't have any drafts saved up yet, but I have plenty of time. I haven't written a single chapter for tomorrow, so the promised burst of updates probably won't be released all at once. In the few days since I left my job, I've basically been having insomnia all night, then going to bed around 7 or 8 in the morning and waking up around noon. Even though I have plenty of time to write, I just can't muster any interest in it and only manage to write a couple of chapters before stopping. So I'm not sure myself how many words I can actually write in a burst of updates. I might tie myself to a chair and see how much I can type out before posting it. That's all, sigh. I don't know why I said things that would inevitably affect the results in my book launch announcement. It feels like I don't want to live anymore, but I don't want to die, so I might as well stab myself to bleed a little, and then tell everyone, I'm dying, so please stop stabbing me. And deep down, I secretly hope that some kind person passing by will pull the knife out and save me, or at least let me die faster. Touching the publish button felt like hesitating while holding a knife. In short, I hope this book will turn out well. I'm sorry for conveying so much negative emotion to everyone. May you never run out of books to read. End of this chapter. Chapter 86 Boxing Gauntlet. Chapter 86 Boxing Gauntlet, subscribe with caution. Everything that needed to be said has been said in the remarks. I'd like to reiterate that you should be able to see this content even without subscribing. If you want to support me, just subscribe to one chapter as a token of your support. I know how many people think this book is just so-so. I'm not sure about what happens next, so please subscribe with caution. That's it, the above word count is free. What? Upon hearing Gwen say that she wasn't the only one who had strayed into this world, Luca immediately became wary. To my surprise, I only found out after asking around. The other Gwen refers to is not a person, but spider mech. At this moment, in the middle of the night, Luca once again had Samira drive him and Gwen back to New York. There was nothing she could do. Gwen told her that a high-tech mech manufactured in 3145 had also accidentally entered this parallel universe with her, and that Gwen had simply hidden the mech in an abandoned sewer. Luca couldn't sit still any longer. He forcibly took the injured Gwen out and found the place where the mechs were hidden, as she had mentioned. It really is Penny Parker's spider-like mech. That's right, Luca already knew after hearing Gwen's explanation. The mecha Gwen mentioned was the vehicle of another Spider-Man, Penny Parker, a high-tech Spider-Man from the future who piloted a mecha and who traveled with her to that parallel universe. However, due to the severe damage to the mech, Penny Parker only took the mutated spider from the mech's core when she left that world. As a result, by sheer coincidence, this mech ended up traveling to this world along with Gwen. The reason Gwen was so badly injured was that she still went to rob the homeless man. It was because the other party accidentally found the equipment parts that Gwen had taken from this mech. Looking at this classic Spider-Man red and blue color scheme mech in front of me. Although it was completely destroyed, with a large hole in the C***T and 2 of its original 4 spider legs missing. However, since it originates from the future technology of 3145, even if it is just a remnant, it still has considerable research value. This is the mecha I was talking about. Although it can no longer be started, it contains data on how to operate and control the particle collider. We were able to return thanks to the control USB drive that Penny made. Gwen paused slightly at this point. After all, it doesn't seem like she really returned to her original world. Thinking about all this, Gwen felt that even the precious USB drive in her hand didn't seem so important anymore. However, Luca had no time to pay attention to the girl's little thoughts at the moment. Because Luca only realized this after seeing the mecha. It even emitted that faint white light unique to the core components. As expected, things related to these plot characters are more likely to become core components. Reaching out and pressing on the tattered spider mech in front of him, a pale blue-gold finger panel immediately appeared. Boxing Mobile Gear. Pacific Rim World 1-5. Manufacturer, Amara Namani. Core component, SB Dr. Spider Mech. Composite consumables, 1 excavator bucket, 10 smoke grenades, 276 tons of metal scrap. Item description, a miniaturized version of the Jaeger from the Pacific Rim universe. A DIY Jaeger assembled by a genius in a junkyard using scrap metal and Jaeger wreckage. It stands 12.07 meters tall and weighs 276 tons. The mech utilizes a single-person neural network control system, coupled with a spherical gyroscope balancing chamber. Its energy core consists of 2 discarded ion batteries from large Jaegers, giving it powerful propulsion, agility, and the ability to transform into a sphere for rapid movement. It is a prime example of a mid to small-sized Jaeger. Friendly reminder: due to the use of many mechanical components specifically designed for 100-meter class Jaegers, this mid-sized Jaeger possesses excellent fundamental qualities, making it a highly suitable item for upgrading and modifying existing designs. Quickly scan the entire description on the cheat code panel in front of you. Luca's expression changed from initial delight at receiving the new item to astonishment. What the heck? 276 tons, 12.07 meters. After glancing at the panel description and then at the tiny creature in front of me, less than 2 meters tall, I realized. Luca felt that his cheat code was getting increasingly out of control. Although both types of mechs are similarly controlled by neural sensors, well, they're both quite round. But apart from that, Luca couldn't find any other similarities at the moment. Furthermore, while this boxing mech is a bit large, can its technological sophistication really compare to the Spider-Man mech? Of course, no matter what. At least Luca is fairly satisfied with this new prop. Furthermore, before synthesizing the boxing mech, the remains of this spider mech are not entirely useless. Let Haro and Baymax use their combination technique again. Maybe we can analyze some useful technology that way. More importantly, this time the friendly reminder actually mentioned renovation. Thinking of this, Luca looked at the transformation watch on his hand. The friendly reminder before crafting this item mentioned a surprise after crafting, but Luca couldn't figure out where the surprise was. I wonder if this proposed renovation is trying to guide me in some way. The mecha, which was over 10 meters tall, immediately reminded Luca of the Gundams stored in the Haro database. Does this mean I have to modify a Boxer Gundam? Fortunately, the materials needed for this synthesis were still not too difficult to obtain, and Luca planned to synthesize them whenever he had time. Don't just stand there, come and lend a hand, help me load this thing into the car. As he spoke, Luca called over Gwen, who was still in a daze. Although this visitor from another world didn't really have a suitable place to hide things, he just carelessly threw this precious mecha into the sewer. Even Luca couldn't help but marvel at the other party's audacity. However, just as Luca, the healthy guy, was carrying 2 spider legs in each hand, and Gwen, the seriously injured one, was carrying the more than 1 meter long Mech C **T, preparing to walk out of the sewers. At the end of the originally pitch-black sewer, several beams of high-beam flashlights suddenly emanated. At the same time, faint footsteps and voices could be heard in the distance. It's just ahead, turn the corner. That's where I found these things, but that guy took everything else. Wait, what are you doing? I don't want any reward. Bang tilde. A sharp gunshot rang out, interrupting the person's terrified pleas for mercy. At this moment, Luca and the other man immediately became serious. After exchanging a glance, the two immediately put down the wreckage of the mecha they were holding. Before they could make any further moves, the high beams from around the corner in the distance had already turned around. And now, in this almost straight sewer, there is absolutely no place to hide. End of this chapter. Chapter 87 Eavesdropping, Preparing to Take Action. Chapter 87 Eavesdropping, Preparing to Take Action, Second Update. As the flashlight beam shone around the corner into the straight sewer, the figure of the person finally came into view. It turned out to be a team of more than a dozen fully armed Special Forces soldiers. These people were all armed with guns, and they were wearing helmets, masks, and bulletproof vests. While their movements appeared relaxed and casual, their consistent use of a 3-person tactical formation and the occasional displays of alertness suggested that their actions were not simply due to superior equipment. The one in the lead appeared to be the squad leader, and was the only one not wearing a bulky mask. Upon seeing the wreckage of the spider armor illuminated by the high beams, a look of surprise immediately appeared on his face. There really is something good. It seems that Guy wasn't lying after all. At this moment, one of his subordinates quickly stepped forward and asked in a low voice, "Captain, should we notify our superiors?" "No need, we're no longer under their jurisdiction. Let's just take this back." As he spoke, the captain immediately led his men forward to check what good stuff their spoils of war were. And incidentally, they also wanted to try and find traces of the spider monster that attacked their lab earlier. And this moment, Luca, who was being held by Gwen and pressed tightly against the arched ceiling of the sewer, didn't dare to breathe loudly. Keep in mind that Luca was just about to draw Dominator and launch a preemptive strike before the enemy could even spot them, engaging in a fierce battle with them. Unexpectedly, Gwen grabbed Luca by the back of the neck, leaped onto the ceiling, and stuck to the arched roof. However, this level of concealment is actually completely insufficient to avoid being pierced by so many high beams from the opposite direction. It's likely that Gwen acted impulsively in a moment of panic, following her usual logic. Fortunately, Luca reacted quickly and immediately pressed the wristwatch on his wrist. Well, it's not a transformation watch, but a wristwatch that comes with the tactical Tuxedo. It directly activated the built-in stealth function of the Tuxedo. That way, they wouldn't be discovered on the spot and riddled with bullets on the ceiling. Indeed, after showcasing the Tuxedo at the company and making grand promises, Luca naturally put it back on immediately. This excellent prop which can improve one's physical fitness and provides a variety of fancy agent skills, was a must-have for him. However, the invisibility effect of the tuxedo also has a rather awkward aspect. Perhaps the movie was trying to show that our props are scientifically sound. Therefore, the invisibility effect of this equipment can only make the parts covered by the clothing transparent. In other words, Luca's head and hands are still exposed in the open. Moreover, even Gwen, who was attached to Luca on the ceiling, only became transparent in the parts that were blocked by Luca's body. 2 long legs wrapped around Luca's waist to secure him, along with a few stray strands of golden hair, were now clearly visible. Fortunately, Gwen was wearing the black leggings of the ghost spider suit, and Luca's head was facing down, so his short brown hair wasn't very noticeable. Only then were the two of them able to barely blend into the pitch-black sewer, ceiling, and avoid being discovered by the visitors immediately. However, the current situation is rather awkward. Luca was facing away from the ground, his body firmly locked to the ceiling by Gwen's legs. He doesn't have any special ability to turn his head 180 degrees. Right now, let alone drawing a gun to shoot downwards, even if you want to check the situation below, you can only rely on peripheral vision and sound to judge. Just then, the dozen or so fully armed Special Forces soldiers quickly arrived directly below Luca and his companion. Luca couldn't see who was speaking, but he could confirm that the one giving orders was the captain who wasn't wearing a mask. "You 3, come here, pack this thing up and carry it on your backs. Check if there are any parts left behind around here. The rest of you, split into 4 groups and search this area for traces of that spider-like monster." Upon hearing this, Luca immediately thought of the experimental base that Gwen had mentioned earlier. He immediately moved closer and whispered in her ear, his voice barely audible. "Are these the people from the lab you mentioned?" Feeling the warm, tingling sensation coming from beside her ears, Gwen's mind went blank for a moment, and she almost lost her balance and fell straight off the roof. He intended to dodge, but then he thought of the large group of people below, his own still healing injuries, and the fact that he had to cling to Luca and stick to the ceiling. In the end, Gwen only turned red in the face, and her body stiffened. He leaned close to Luca's ear and whispered something. Their attire was somewhat similar to that of the ordinary people who surrounded me, but with such standard equipment and no distinguishing features, I couldn't be sure if they were the same group of people. "Stop talking nonsense, that's it," Luca rolled his eyes. "There's no Spider-Man activity in this world yet, and the other side is already calling him a Spider-Man monster, and his equipment is similar to those other people's. How can this be considered uncertain? These superheroes are such a handful." At this moment, Luca was already considering how to eliminate the group below. However, before he could even make a move, someone spoke again from the ground below. "Captain, we've found quite a few footprints here." Upon hearing this, the captain immediately asked a question. When were these footprints found?" "The footprints are very fresh, no more than half an hour old, and there are clearly 2 different people's footprints, which extended all the way from that side." Without even looking, Luca knew from the sound that the other person was pointing in the direction they had come from, which was exactly the opposite of the direction these people were pointing from. The sewers were not clean to begin with, and the 2 of them did not try to hide it, so it was perfectly normal for them to leave some footprints. Upon hearing his subordinate's words, the captain immediately made a decision. "You few stay here and take all these items back to the car. The rest of you, come with me, follow the footprints and keep chasing." Immediately afterwards, Luca heard a large number of footsteps gradually fading away and becoming smaller, and his heart tightened immediately. "Damn, Samira's still waiting for me at the sewer exit." Although there is a nearly deserted road right outside the sewer outlet, it seems normal for cars to be parked there. But who knows if these people, or Samira who saw them running away, will take action. When the enemy outnumbers us, Samira will likely be in danger. Andy can't let them take my precious mecha away. Without hesitation, Luca immediately whispered to Gwen. "How many people are left down there?" 6, 3 on each side. At this point, Luca didn't have time to consider which side was stronger or weaker, and decisively made his move. Fine, in a bit, just flip me over and throw me at the guy on the left, and you deal with the one on the right. End of this chapter. Chapter 88 Flying Kick, Hook and Loop, Tuxedo. Chapter 88 Flying Kick, Hook and Loop, Tuxedo, third update. As he spoke, Luca also handed the web shooter that he had borrowed earlier to Gwen, entrusting it to her for safekeeping for the time being. He then spoke in a low voice. Do it. As soon as he finished speaking, Luca felt a tremendous force coming from his waist. He flipped 180 degrees in midair. Then her waist tightened again, and Gwen suddenly exerted force in her waist and abdomen, her body swinging rapidly on the ceiling, instantly throwing Luca away. Wow, Tilda, what a great waist, what great legs. With his mind filled with distracting thoughts, Luca lunged at the three people packing up the spider mech on his left in an extremely bizarre posture. Such a loud commotion on the ceiling naturally attracted the attention of several Special Forces soldiers on the ground. They immediately looked up in the direction from which the sound came from. However, it doesn't matter if you don't look at it. Upon closer inspection, the group was horrified to discover that a human head was floating above them, rapidly flying towards them. More importantly, the head was still alive. It even started talking. Damn it, this is the left, Luca cursed. He had completely forgotten that he and Gwen were originally facing each other, but their left and right sides were not aligned. But these minor mishaps did not prevent him from quickly adjusting his posture. Careful! Before the first person to react could even offer a warning. Suddenly, Luca's head, which was in midair, and his previously empty body parts reappeared as if flowing with mercury. Moreover, at this moment, he was already in a bent-over posture. At the same time, the sneakers on his feet also flashed with colorful light and electric arcs. Next moment, bam! There was a loud bang. Luca's third gear kick landed squarely on the head of the person who had spoken. In an instant, all the words that the man was about to say were swallowed back down. His entire head felt like a ball that had been violently slapped, with white shockwaves emanating from it. Immediately afterwards, it spun and flew sideways. And his head struck another companion's head precisely. With just that one kick, the two of them were tumbling around like gourds, crashing into the wall behind them. However, it depends on the situation. The second person appeared to have simply passed out. But the unfortunate guy who was first kicked in the head by Luca had his helmet shattered and dented, oozing a lot of blood, and his neck was twisted into a rather strange angle. I don't even know if I'll survive. However, there was no movement and no pain, so it seems like it's not a big problem. Meanwhile, Luca himself. It was by using the slight reaction force from that kick that he managed to neutralize the impact of his fall. With a light and swift roll, he landed smoothly. However, these people did indeed seem to be, as Luca had previously guessed, not only well-equipped, but also possessing excellent tactical skills. The last person remaining on the left, although he first experienced being resurrected from a dead body, then watched helplessly as his two teammates were violently blown away, their fates unknown. However, they still quickly made the most correct judgment. He immediately raised his gun, ready to fire at Luca, who had just rolled to his feet. However, before he could actually pull the trigger and begin firing. During the roll, Luca somehow managed to roll up the sleeve of his right suit jacket to his elbow. The entire robotic arm was exposed. Of course, Luca's move was definitely not to show off his sweet captive to the enemy. Suddenly, a grappling hook shot out from the elbow joint of his mechanical arm, hitting the man's chest precisely and piercing through him without any surprise. Ah, Tilda. The man who was pierced by the metal hook immediately let out a scream. But that's not all. As Luca planted his feet firmly, the mechanism connecting the hook to his arm spun rapidly. The tall, fully armed man, over 1.8 meters tall, was actually pulled back by this thin rope. The immense pain and the terrifying tearing force in his chest caused the man's gun to fly out of his hand. By the time the man was swiftly pulled in front of Luca, Luca had already changed his fist into a palm. With a bang, the mechanical right hand gripped the person's face tightly. Immediately afterwards, Sweet Captive exerted force with all 5 fingers. With a series of snap sounds, the man's mask and helmet were instantly crushed by the robotic arm. The shattered nail plates were embedded in his face. Before he could scream any further, Luca slammed his right arm into the ground. Boom tilde. The cement floor is slightly cracked. This enemy followed in the footsteps of his 2 teammates. Having finished dealing with everything, Luca turned around and looked at the 3 enemies on the other side. At the same time, he was still thinking about it. Tuxedos really don't suit me. What's the point of this electric shock-stimulating robotic arm? In fact, Luca had already discovered this problem in tests a few days earlier. Since the principle of the tuxedo is to stimulate muscles with electric shocks to make various movements, the body is actually operating in semi-automatic mode during combat. In this situation, the robotic right arm, which cannot receive electrical stimulation, not only fails to be strengthened and develops problems with uncoordinated movements, but also frequently malfunctions due to the constant, minute electrical shocks. That's why, after Luca deactivated his invisibility, the first thing he thought of was rolling up his sleeves again. However, he doesn't seem to have time to consider the compatibility between these props right now. Because only after turning around did Luca realize. I don't know if it was because I forced myself to stay on the ceiling for too long that my injuries worsened. Gwen, the mighty ghost spider, is actually fighting back and forth with those 3 ordinary special forces soldiers, and hasn't been able to defeat them yet. Seeing this, Luca decisively exerted force with his feet. It suddenly charged towards the 4 people fighting together, while its right mechanical arm rose again. With a whoosh, the grappling hook pierced another man's chest. It's great that I can hit the bullseye every time tilde yeah, although when I'm shooting, I can only aim at the chest tilde. Repeat the same steps. With Luca's help, Gwen, despite her serious injuries, finally managed to defeat the other 2. However, perhaps out of superhero habit, even though she had almost died at the hands of these 2, Gwen did not choose to kill them. Instead, after knocking the 2 unconscious, he frowned and looked at the men that Luca had killed. However, before she could comment on it, the commotion from the battle had already drawn back the dozen or so people who hadn't gone far. End of this chapter, Chapter 89, Disguise Fails, Lien Chan. Chapter 89, The Disguise Fails, Lien Chan, 4th update. The sound of hurried footsteps approached from afar, causing Gwen, who was about to say something, to immediately turn around. Fortunately, it was just footsteps. The enemies who had noticed the commotion were simply heading back and hadn't shown themselves yet. After figuring things out, Gwen instinctively wanted to turn around and run away with Luca. But when she turned around again, she found. In the short time it took for him to turn his head to investigate, Luca had already disappeared from behind him. This coward. Gwen muttered a curse under her breath. In this situation, Luca had disappeared without a trace. In her opinion, the only possibility was that he had heard the footsteps and then abandoned her and ran away. Moreover, they might have been using some strange invisibility ability to escape, which is why I was caught off guard and didn't notice them. Fortunately, there's only one path through the sewers. With enemies all in front of him, Luca could only have escaped by following the corner the enemies had just turned. Gwen naturally followed this path. However, because of this brief moment of distraction, the enemies who had followed the footprints earlier at the end of the sewers revealed themselves again. Upon seeing Gwen, these men immediately raised their guns and began firing without saying a word. For a moment, the sound of gunfire was deafening, making the otherwise empty sewer particularly noisy. Fortunately, Gwen's injury was only serious, mainly affecting issues like muscle strength. The spider sense ability that Spider-Man possesses is not diminished as a result. Unless it's an unbelievable, guaranteed hit like Luca's, it's very difficult for ordinary long-range attacks to hit Gwen, who can anticipate danger, unless there's a wide-area blockade. She simply dodged and weaved a few times, and all the bullets that were fired missed. By the time these people caught up, Gwen was already almost at the corner. Chase, don't let her run away. At the captain's command, the rest of the team members immediately followed. However, it wasn't until the last two were about to pass him that the captain spoke up to remind them. You two stay here and see if there are any survivors. Also, watch over this mech and wait for us to return. Yes. The two subordinates immediately stopped, while the captain and the others quickly chased after Gwen in the direction she had disappeared. However, before these people could run very far, of the two who remained, one of them suddenly exclaimed in surprise, "Wait a minute, there's one extra one." The man originally intended to follow his captain's orders, stay here to treat his teammates and guard the spoils of war. But he only realized it when his gaze fell on the ground. Originally, there should have been 6 teammates left here, but now there are 7 fully armed people lying haphazardly on the ground. Upon hearing his exclamation, the captain who had been about to continue chasing also slowly stopped. The 2 people running ahead of him also slowed down. However, it was at this moment that a corpse that was lying on the ground, with its helmet smashed and seemingly dead beyond any doubt, suddenly leaped up. And with a powerful stomp of his feet, he rushed to the person who had just spoken at a terrifying speed, far exceeding that of humans. "You talk too much." In the blink of an eye, a figure appeared. Then the corpse threw a straight punch with its right hand, accompanied by the sound of wind breaking. With a boom. Before the guy could even react to what was happening, his helmet exploded on the spot. His entire face caved in, and he flew backward quickly, his face covered in debris. Indeed, compared to fists, grips are more effective at unleashing the power of the sweet captive. Looking at his blood-soaked fist, Luca muttered to himself. Yes, the guy lying on the ground pretending to be a corpse is none other than Luca, that cunning bastard. In reality, even with the electric shocks from the tuxedo that enhanced his physique, Luca couldn't possibly have disappeared around the corner the instant Gwen turned around. He simply activated the transformation watch ability at the same time Gwen turned around, scanned a corpse he had killed, and then used projection to cover it up and disguise it. Luca had originally planned to lie there secretly and try to wait until these people ran past before launching a sneak attack from behind. If the timing is right, a well-charged, wide-range ion decomposition ball might be enough to wipe out this whole group. To everyone's surprise, the opposing captain not only left 2 people to treat the wounded, but before everyone had even run far, one of them noticed the unusual situation at the scene. Left with no other option, Luca had to launch a sudden attack and take down one of them first. As for Gwen, who was being chased, Luca will definitely be saved. After all, he had just returned the web launcher to the other party, and Luca also wanted to get the formula for the web liquid from the other party. If he gets killed, who knows when Luca will be able to collect Conan 5-5 again and crack the spiderweb liquid again. However, Luca wouldn't care much if the other party got injured during the chase. Currently, apart from the captain, there are 3 fully armed enemies remaining. The others didn't notice the commotion behind them, and all chased after Gwen around the corner. Looking at the current situation, Luca casually shook his fist and said softly, "Perfect, we've left a big fish behind. Let's capture him alive first." As he spoke, Luca gave the 4 people opposite him a friendly smile. However, he had not yet deactivated his transformation. The blood-soaked, mangled face scanned by the watch looked rather terrifying to the people opposite. Fortunately, the people on the other side were all experienced Special Forces soldiers. Although they still didn't know what Luca was, since they had already started fighting, they confirmed that he was the enemy. The men immediately raised their guns in unison and began firing. Unfortunately for Luca, who was well prepared, he only needed to exert a little force with his feet to dash sideways. With the combined power of strength-enhancing shoes and tuxedo, he appeared as elusive as a ghost. After quickly dodging the incoming bullets, before these people could even turn their guns around again, Luca lightly touched the wall with his toes, quickly turned around and rushed to the front of an enemy. This man was quite experienced and didn't intend to continue shooting at this moment. He swung his submachine gun directly at Luca's head. However, Luca simply raised his hand and deflected the gun barrel that was about to smash into his face with a graceful parting of his mane. Then, his right arm, no longer under the control of the Tuxedo, suddenly shot out and grabbed the neck of the enemy in front of him. Next moment, click tilde. The person in front of me had his spine broken, just like a chick. Luca, however, spoke softly with a calm expression. The first one tilde. End of this chapter. Chapter 90, the nine-headed serpent with the black flag. Chapter 90, the Hydra's black flag. 5th update. Ugh tilde, this is so damn embarrassing. Luca, who had just been putting on a cool and aloof act, felt goosebumps all over his body after he finished speaking. However, the three opponents didn't care about that. After being shocked by his skills, they immediately regrouped and started firing in their direction. Even while unleashing their firepower, the three of them did not forget to retreat in an orderly manner. However, Luca was still carrying a fully armed corpse in his hand at that moment. Facing the enemy's hail of bullets, he didn't even try to dodge. He simply held the corpse in his hand high in front of him and charged forward again. In an instant, a dense hail of bullets pierced into the humanoid shield in Luca's hand with a series of thuds. The already dead corpse in his hands had gained more than a pound in that short time. Sure enough, as long as I hold up a shield, the enemy will only focus on attacking the shield. Of course, this is just a joke. The reason Luca dared to impersonate Captain America while holding a human-shaped shield was that the shield itself was large enough, fully armed, and had excellent bulletproof quality. Another one is, well, the tailcoat item itself has a completely unscientific bulletproof ability. Let alone the small-caliber submachine guns used for urban warfare on the other side. Even a regular kinetic energy rifle would only cause pain, swelling, or minor fractures at most, and would be completely incapable of killing Luca. Right now, all he needs to do is protect his exposed head. It sounds long-winded, but in reality, it only took a few seconds from Luca raising his shield for cover to charging through a hail of bullets. Seeing that he was close enough to the enemy, Luca ignored the seemingly endless barrage of fire. In an instant, all the muscles in my body exerted force at the same time, and the unique tingling sensation of the electric current from the Tuxedo spread throughout my body. Immediately afterwards, Luca flung the bullet-riddled corpse from his hands away. The corpse, having withstood the hail of bullets, acted like a bullet absorber and slammed directly towards the three who had fired the shots. Careful! The captain who reacted the fastest immediately shouted, but it was too late. The unlucky guy standing next to him was smashed by the corpse and sent flying backward. Left with no other option, he could only roll on the ground to dodge. However, it was precisely at this moment, when his averted gaze was obstructed, that things changed. Luca immediately shot out a grappling hook from his elbow, which landed on the sewer roof. He then took 2 quick steps and jumped. Just like Spider-Man, he swung directly in front of his last henchman. With one leg straight and the other bent, he delivered a perfect knight's flying kick to the man's face. Click tilde. A crisp sound of bones breaking. The person bent their neck at a 90-degree angle and enjoyed the quick sleep brought on by the chiropractic adjustment. At this moment, the captain, who had already gotten up again, could no longer maintain his previous calm and professionalism. His face was full of ferocity and fear as he frantically screamed and pulled the trigger. Die, monster! However, no matter how he pulled the trigger, the gun in his hand only produced a series of click-click sounds of the empty magazine mechanism clashing. It turned out that, having lost his mind, he hadn't even noticed that the magazine in his hand was empty. Seeing this, Luca simply shook his head and chuckled, calmly walking towards him step by step. In the empty sewers, each footstep seemed to pound on the captain's heart. All right, stop yelling. I wasn't planning on killing you. I was even thinking of asking you some questions. Looking at Luca's broken face, with its blood-stained, ferocious grin. As if sensing something was amiss, the captain, in a frenzied manner, threw his gun at Luca. At the same time, he swiftly drew a dagger from his waist and gripped it in a reverse hand. However, just as Luca thought this man was stubborn and still wanted to fight him in close combat, he simply cried out loudly, his eyes filled with terror and pleading. Don't kill me, I still have a chance. Upon hearing this, Luca was naturally filled with questions. I said I wouldn't kill you, you. Before Luca could finish speaking, the man's left eye appeared to explode as if his eyeball had burst. The surrounding blood vessels were bulging, the eye sockets were slightly protruding, and the entire eye was filled with blood. The dagger he had been gripping tightly in his hand clattered to the ground. Then, with a look of terror on his face, he fell straight to the ground. This. Luca, who had just felt he had everything under control and was about to knock the other person unconscious, suddenly became serious. Is this a remotely controlled miniature bomb implanted in someone's head? Somewhat surprised and uncertain, Luca raised his wrist and fired a grappling hook. However, this time the grappling hook did not auto-aim into the chest of the fallen captain. Instead, it quickly sank into the man's arm. Really dead? Luca didn't believe that the other party was admitting to faking death and wanted to retaliate. But he must believe in the inherent power of rules that come with the cheat system. The sweet captive item will automatically lock onto and penetrate the chest of any living creature it targets, ensuring that it can be pulled back. Only when targeting inanimate objects will the shot be truly accurate, allowing Luca to make rapid movements. Given the current situation of being shot in the arm, the only possibility is that the other party is already a lifeless corpse. However, the bizarre explosion of the other party's eyeball just now gave him a strange sense of familiarity. Take a few quick steps forward and turn the body over to examine it. Upon reaching out and touching it, as expected, it's a mechanical eyeball. At this moment, Luca recalled that there seemed to be a high-ranking Hydra agent lurking within SHIELD who used similar methods to control his subordinates. I think it's called Thousand Mile Eyes. More importantly, this scene that triggered his memories also reminded Luca of someone else he had just met. Heinrich von Stein. Damn, that guy's eyes are glowing. Could he be one of Clairvoyant's men too? His name contains the character Feng, and he has connections in Europe, regenerative capital. Hydra's motto was cut off one head, and two will grow back, and its core components were remnants of Nazism. Damn, I should have thought of that. No, wait, my name also has Feng in it. Regenerative capital invested in the company when it was just starting out. What his parents said, that Feng is a Chinese transliteration, could they have lied to him too? At that moment, Luca felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be that a perfectly good American capitalist company with a bright future has inexplicably become the black flag of Hydra? Then I looked at the group of unfortunate souls lying dead on the ground. What's this? Did the flood wash away the Dragon King's temple? End of this chapter. Chapter 91, Identity Exposed. Chapter 91, Identity Exposed, damn it. Why think so much? Realizing that his family might have some unclear relationship with Hydra, Luca's first action was to finish off the unconscious enemies present one by one. Then I checked it again carefully. Fortunately, apart from this captain, none of the others had any surveillance equipment on them. At this moment, Luca was beginning to feel somewhat fortunate for his earlier sudden idea to use the transformation watch for a disguise. Otherwise, during the fight with these people just now, his identity would have been exposed to the person behind the scenes through this mechanical eye. After quickly finishing these follow-up tasks, Luca remembered that Gwen was waiting for his rescue on the other side. Something's not right. The gunfire over here is pretty loud too. Why haven't any of his men come back to check? After a moment's thought, Luca simply grabbed a relatively intact corpse from the pile of bodies, rescanned it with his transformation watch to overwrite the original transformation state, then picked up a submachine gun and chased after Gwen in the direction she had fled. Along the way, Luca even encountered several Special Forces soldiers who had been knocked unconscious by Gwen. Without much hesitation, they were all sent on their way. As they walked along, they came to a fork in the road in the sewers. The eerie silence around them made Luca suspicious. Always trusting his intuition, he instinctively tried to dodge to the side. But then he made his move. A white, viscous substance, like a rapidly flying bullet, struck Luca's right hand, which was holding the gun. Although the viscous substance that flew towards them didn't have much kinetic energy, it still managed to shoot Luca's right hand, along with the gun in his hand, against the wall, turning it into a spider web that firmly held Luca in place. Immediately afterwards, a white figure darted over and threw a punch at Luca's face. "It's me." Luca, who already knew who the person was, immediately called out. At the same time, the right robotic arm suddenly exerted force, tearing apart the spider web that trapped it, along with a small section of the wall. He quickly moved to block Gwen's incoming punch. Even so, the punch still sent Luca staggering backward, slamming him heavily against the wall behind him. Feeling the burning pain in his back, he grimaced and spoke again. "Stop, it's me." Although he was explaining, Luca still didn't drop the pretense. He was still in danger here, and he didn't want to take any risk of exposing his identity. Fortunately, even though she had never seen Luca's transformation ability before, Gwen realized who the person in front of her was after 2 explanations. The long leg that was about to kick Luca's neck was immediately and slowly retracted. Watching Gwen's decisive moves and swift, clean combos, it was truly impressive. Luca, still grinning, couldn't help but complain. "I haven't seen you use the web shooter at all along, but you were decisive when you attacked me. But it would have been better if he hadn't said anything." After saying that, Gwen, who had already stopped exerting her strength, immediately rolled her eyes. "My spider fluid has been emptied out. That last bit was the last shot." She said she'd been left out, but Gwen's eyes were fixed on Luca. It was only then that Luca realized what was happening. Indeed, at this moment, Haro was still at home analyzing the composition ratio of spider web fluid for himself, and it might really be empty inside. However, since Luca was thick-skinned enough, he didn't respond and simply changed the subject. "Have all the people who were pursuing you been dealt with?" Gwen didn't answer immediately either, but her pretty face flushed slightly as she awkwardly said, "Let go first." Luca looked over and lo and behold, his sweet captive was still tightly gripping the other's fist. Although this robotic arm is very flexible, that's its only drawback. Despite being disguised as an ordinary Special Forces soldier, under the influence of the power of concept, his right hand looked and felt exactly like a real hand to outsiders. But in reality, he himself has absolutely no sense of touch. Luca quickly released his grip, letting Gwen pull her hand back before asking again, "What were you thinking, lying in ambush here?" Gwen's expression had returned to normal. Although she was inwardly amazed by Luca's strength, she still spoke quickly. "Let's go back the way we came. We can talk as we go." Upon hearing this, Luca knew that they were not yet out of danger, so he didn't say anything more and immediately followed Gwen's footsteps. It was at this moment that Gwen spoke again, explaining what had happened earlier. In reality, Gwen wasn't planning to ambush anyone here. Those who had been chasing her were all wiped out by Luca, as several of them had stayed behind. So Gwen's side ran and fought back all the way, and had already taken down everyone. However, when she reached the end of the sewer, she discovered that someone was guarding the exit. Gwen, already somewhat exhausted, dared not launch a rash attack. Moreover, after calming down, she realized what had happened, having not found any trace of Luca along the way. Did Luca not run away beforehand at all? On the contrary, was he the one who abandoned his teammates and ran away? Well, what she thought was that Luca had used his invisibility ability to hide his head and avoid being seen. So Gwen went back the way she came, searching for Luca. They only happened to run into him at the crossroads, mistaking the transformed Luca for other pursuers, which is why they launched the first attack. However, after hearing this story, Luca's focus was not on the other person's complex feelings of guilt. Instead, he immediately stopped and asked the question, "So, there are still enemies you knocked unconscious behind the fork in the road that you haven't dealt with?" Seeing Luca suddenly stop, Gwen also stopped and frowned even more after hearing his question. She had wanted to say something when she saw Luca fight without holding back, and now that the old matter had been brought up again, Gwen immediately spoke in a serious tone. Yes, they were just knocked unconscious. Although these people are criminals, they should still be handed over to the police. If I kill them, how am I any different from a criminal? Upon hearing Gwen's words, Luca rolled his eyes. Well, even though he was fully armed at the moment, Gwen couldn't see his eyes. However, at a time like this, Luca was too lazy to argue with the other party about the relationship between street heroes and the law. If these people are really Hydra, they might even have a nominal position within Snakes, HIELD, and in terms of law enforcement authority, they might even have priority over Gwen, the vigilante. Luca simply said it casually. Have you forgotten? You weren't wearing a mask today. End of this chapter. Chapter 92, okay? You don and #039 mind. Chapter 92, okay? You don't mind. Second update. Have you forgotten that you weren't wearing a mask today? Upon hearing this, Gwen initially wanted to retort, arguing that she wasn't from this world and therefore had no identity. However, the next moment, Gwen immediately thought of what Luca had said before, that he knew himself in this parallel universe. At that moment, she felt a buzzing in her head and blurted out the answer subconsciously. It's over. This kind of thing doesn't require much thought. Even a fool could figure it out. These are clearly not benevolent individuals. If they were to trace Gwen's identity based on her appearance, they might just kill her without hesitation. For a moment, Gwen was caught in a struggle between killing to silence and keeping the line drawn. If Gwen herself had exposed her identity in her original world, she would have preferred to die rather than compromise her principles. But right now, because of my own actions, I'm worried that innocent Gwen, or even her family, might be put in danger. Gwen dared not think any further at this point. However, she dared not think any further, but Luca, on the other hand, insisted on adding insult to injury, continuing to speak in that indifferent tone. Actually, maybe we don't need to silence them. Upon hearing this, Gwen's hope was immediately rekindled. I've seen it. The leader of this group had a modified, networked mechanical eye in his left eye. Your appearance may have already been exposed to the person behind the scenes through that mechanical eye. Well, Gwen is now completely desperate. Given her current physical condition, and being in this unfamiliar parallel universe, she couldn't possibly risk her life to protect the Gwen family. However, while Luca was attacking Gwen, a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Gwen said there are people guarding the exit. Now that the news has spread, aren't these people? Just as Luca was thinking this, sure enough, faint lights and hurried footsteps could be heard again in the distance. Just by listening to the footsteps that could travel such a distance, one could be certain that the approaching group was no small number. There's no need to guess anymore. The news must have already spread. Damn it, you didn't say there were so many people outside. Let's go. As he spoke, Luca grabbed Gwen, who was still standing there in a daze, and quickly headed back to where they had come from. At this moment, Gwen, who had barely come to her senses, explained in a low voice. When I looked just now, there weren't many people outside. So they're just waiting for reinforcements. Stop talking nonsense and run. After saying that, Luca shook off Gwen's hand and activated the Tuxedo function to enhance his physical abilities again, while simultaneously exerting force with his feet. He darted out like a cheetah, leaving Gwen far behind. After running back to the place where the battle had taken place, this time, Luca didn't pretend to be weak and modest. Without saying a word, he directly lifted the Spider Mech C **T, which was more than a meter in diameter, and even used his free hand to hold 2 mech limbs. However, this delay allowed Gwen, who was a step behind him, to catch up. Seeing that even at this point, Luca still hadn't forgotten to bring the key item that would allow him to return to his original world, he immediately whispered something. Let me take this. You'll slow things down if you do it this way. But before she could even reach for the spider mech Luca was carrying, Luca, who had already adjusted his posture, turned around and dashed off without looking back, cursing and scolding as he did so. Mind your own business. What are you dawdling about and not running for your lives? Seeing Luca's back as he carried his things and fled like a refugee, Gwen, whose mind was starting to sluggish, could only grit her teeth and quickly follow. Fortunately, perhaps Luca and Gwen's physical abilities are indeed beyond those of ordinary people. Or perhaps the pursuers were afraid of being ambushed and didn't give chase at full speed. When the two of them ran to the sewer exit, they no longer encountered any pursuers behind them. Luca, carrying a spherical C***T, kicked open the large iron gate of the sewer maintenance passage. After confirming that there was no one else outside, he rushed towards where Samira had parked. Before he could even reach the car, Luca saw Samira turn around and look in his direction, so he shouted out, "It's me, transform." He uttered just 2 simple words, and at the same time, he saw Gwen following behind him. Samira, who had been somewhat wary, immediately recalled the strange watch her young master had invented. Although she didn't understand what had happened for a moment, seeing Luca's anxious and desperate escape, she immediately realized that something had changed. He immediately opened the door and rushed out of the car, opening the rear door. Since we knew beforehand that we were coming to find the spider mech, we prepared a large vehicle. While helping Luca stuff the spider mech into the carriage, Samira quickly asked, "Young master, what happened?" After haphazardly stuffing his things into the carriage, Luca spoke quickly while turning the dial of his transformation watch. "Get in the car first." As he said this, Luca turned back to look at Gwen, who was already panting. "You too, get in the car first. I'll figure out what to do if your identity gets exposed." As she was changing her body shape, her voice sounded a little distorted, but Gwen still heard what she was saying. This time, however, she watched helplessly as Luca made a magic trick right in front of her. Even though Gwen was already somewhat dazed, she knew that this wasn't the priority right now. He immediately chose to obey Luca's orders and quickly climbed into the carriage. As for Luca, out of caution, he still did not choose to restore his original appearance. The only change was to adjust the appearance of the watch to that of the young man named Bernard, who was previously given as a startup gift. However, Luca realized this at that moment. The trouble that's coming next may not just be on Gwen's side. Although she didn't reveal her appearance this time, she hadn't considered the possibility of danger before coming, so Samira didn't think about hiding her whereabouts at all while driving. Even though the United States, in order to ensure that everyone has the right to commit crimes, has a very low rate of surveillance coverage in cities. But given Hydra's capabilities, they might still be able to trace it back to me, so I must find a way to extricate myself from this matter as soon as possible. After getting into the car, Luca gave the instructions immediately. "Samira, drive. Drive around in deserted areas, don't rush home." After saying that, Luca stopped paying attention to Samira, who quickly started the car. Instead, he turned to look at Gwen in the back seat and said with a serious expression, "Now, listen to me. Are you willing to reveal your identity as a visitor from another world to others? Okay, you don't mind." End of this chapter, Chapter 93, U&039, Re Not the Only 11. Chapter 93, You're Not the Only One, third update. At this critical moment, Gwen was still agonizing over whether or not to reveal her identity as a visitor from another world. Luca promptly provided the answer for the other party. "Okay, I know you don't mind." After saying that, he immediately took out his phone to contact outside help. That's right. In this situation where things are getting really bad, Luca's only thought is to use the surefire way to deal with the villains, the great reporting technique. However, at this moment, Luca did not intend to follow his original plan and try to summon the Ancient One by cursing the sky. It's not that he's afraid of getting beaten up at this point. The main point is that if it's simply about solving the problem of Gwen's identity as a visitor from a parallel universe, then the Ancient One is definitely the right person for the job. But now that Hydra has gotten involved, there's always the risk of exposing their home planet. A great being like the Ancient One wouldn't concern herself with such trivial matters as infighting among Earthlings. Then it becomes obvious who to contact. "Dunshin, I need you to come over. Drive here and bring me hello." Not that one. After briefly explaining things to Dunshin, Luca redialed again, this time to contact the foreign aide he actually wanted to reach. "Hello, Mr. Stark. I might need your help with something small." Downstairs at Stark Tower, well, maybe it should be called Avengers Tower now. Although repairs and renovations are still underway, the prominent logo on the roof has been replaced with a capital A. Seeing the steel suit slowly descending from the sky, its arms and legs spewing out iron flames, not to mention everyone else. Even Luca was somewhat dumbfounded. No, they're fully armed already. Before Luca and the other two could even speak, Tony Stark's somewhat distorted voice came from within the Iron Man suit. Captain Tsubasa, is this the visitor from the parallel world you were talking about? The suit's gaze swept over Gwen standing behind Luca, and it was unclear whether it had analyzed anything before it continued speaking. Let's go upstairs first and talk about it then. With that, Tony Stark walked toward the elevator in the building on his own. To be honest, apart from the phone call in the car just now, Luca and Tony Stark didn't have any serious conversations at all. The other party's decisive attitude actually made Luca breathe a sigh of relief. If Iron Man really treats him the way he treats Spider-Man in the future, Luca will actually be in an awkward position. She turned around and exchanged a glance with Gwen beside her, her eyes clearly asking a question. Is this what you meant by generous assistance? Seeing this, Luca, who was holding Haro in his arms, could only shrug slightly and quickly followed. However, once they arrived at the top of Avengers Tower, even Luca, who had been relatively calm just moments before, had a change in expression. It's not that I felt slighted, because Tony Stark's real body was still in the room, and he was just remotely controlling his suit to meet me. Besides Tony Stark, Bruce Banner and Thor were also present. Luca said with a bitter face, Mr. Stark, is this what you meant by no outsiders? The reason he brought Gwen here so openly, instead of returning home, was because Tony had previously said that there were no outsiders here. Knowing he needed the other party's help and couldn't hide his identity, he came without any disguise. Little did he expect that what he thought would be a private meeting would turn into an Avengers meet and greet. Thankfully, the SHIELD people weren't there, and thankfully, I didn't mention Hydra's existence during the phone call. Actually, Thor alone isn't a big deal. Although he's a bit carefree, he's an alien after all, and probably wouldn't have any contact with Hydra. But as one of only 2 scientific geniuses in the current Avengers, Bruce Banner inevitably has some interactions with SHIELD. Stark hasn't already notified SHIELD, has he? That's practically the same as telling Hydra. With that in mind, Luca decided against going into detail about the existence of Hydra. Putting aside the possibly ambiguous relationship between his own family and Hydra. Directly targeting Hydra might lead to their vengeful actions. However, if it was just an unintentional disruption of their operation, simply destroying one of their bases, there would still be room for maneuver afterwards. However, Tony Stark's next words almost disrupted Luca's train of thought again. Tony casually put the tablet aside, glanced at Luca, who looked somewhat conflicted, and then spoke. In fact, I suspect that what you just told me on the phone is related to what we are investigating, so Dr. Banner and his team may know more than you think. Tony spread his hands, a helpless, bitter smile on his face. But before that, I still hope, well, that this Miss Gwen can prove her identity. After saying that, Banner and Thor, along with the other 2, stared at Gwen standing next to Luca. Clearly, they were all curious about what was so magical about these so-called visitors from another world. However, putting aside Gwen's confusion about how to prove herself, Luca immediately grasped the key point and asked another question. You mean you're investigating this? Are you referring to the visitors from a parallel universe or the mysterious organization that took over Kingpin's lab? But no sooner had Luca finished asking than Gwen, who was standing next to him, seemed to have lost her train of thought. He leaped into the air and with a whoosh, soared to the ceiling. Using both hands and feet, it perched on top of everyone like a giant spider, watching them. Ward, this was Dr. Banner, whose mouth was agape in an O shape. That should prove it, right? Yes, that's Gwen. However, upon seeing this scene, Tony, though equally surprised, shook his head again. Actually, it's not possible after all. Before he could finish speaking, Luca, who was already getting impatient, reached behind Samira, took the long, narrow bag, pulled out a huge mechanical spider leg, and threw it on the ground. This should be enough. According to Gwen, this should be future technology from the year 3145. I think with your technology, you should be able to easily verify its authenticity. All right, now let's get back to the topic we were discussing earlier. What exactly are you investigating? Tony and his two companions exchanged bewildered glances, wondering why Luca, this seemingly gentle and mild-mannered young man, was so impatient. Thor was all right. Even if Earth's technology were 1,000 years in the future, he didn't feel anything. Dr. Banner excitedly went forward to examine the spider leg. Only Tony Stark, after a moment of stunned silence, finally offered his answer. In fact, based on our investigation, we speculate that this Miss Gwen may not be the only visitor from another world. End of this chapter. Chapter 94 seems to be a really big event. Chapter 94 seems to be a really big event. Fourth update. Not the only one. Not only was Luca surprised by Tony's conclusion, but even Gwen, who was still lying on the ceiling, jumped down. What she was thinking right now was, could it be that all of her Spider-Man allies who fought Kingpin together had come to this world? So, what exactly are you investigating? However, Tony shook his head slightly when Luca asked the question. This is not something you, as a child, need to worry about. However, at the same moment he spoke, Dr. Banner, who was fiddling with the mechanical spider legs, also spoke up to complain. It's all because of that bastard Loki pulling the strings behind the scenes. Upon hearing this, an eerie silence fell over the room. Tony Stark stared blankly at Dr. Banner, his eyes seeming to say something. You have such a sieve. Is this the kind of information you can just tell anyone? Dr. Banner looked at Tony with an embarrassed yet innocent expression, blinking repeatedly. So you called him over here just to involve him, didn't you? Tony blinked again. I called him over because of this otherworldly visitor and also to protect this kid. Saul, are your eyes very dry? Seeing the group blinking repeatedly, Luca, who had been quietly observing from the side, was speechless. You're saying these people lack teamwork. They seem to be able to communicate without any barriers just by looking at each other. But to say they have a good understanding. They couldn't even reach an agreement on the most basic and important matter, whether or not to inform each other and involve themselves. Seeing that these people were speaking in Morse code, Luca finally broke the silence and spoke up. This matter has nothing to do with age now. Since I've already been dragged into it, there's a great danger regardless of whether I participate further or not. Instead of keeping things to yourself, you might as well tell me some useful information so I can avoid future risks. Upon hearing this, Thor, who hadn't been able to join the chat channel, spoke up and pointed at Luca. That kid makes a good point. As he spoke, he gave Luca a thumbs up. To be honest, Thor's officially certified perfect appearance, which surpasses human aesthetics, does look quite convincing up close. However, coupled with his somewhat naive expression, it suddenly became less convincing. However, after pondering for a moment, Tony finally gave up struggling and simply explained the current situation to Luca, picking out the things he could say. As mentioned earlier, SHIELD has been searching for Loki's whereabouts ever since the Battle of New York. However, SHIELD chose to rely on a program that Tony and Banner had designed before the Battle of New York to detect gamma energy fluctuations. They then used this program in conjunction with a large number of satellites and signal towers to conduct a thorough search. This method worked at first, allowing them to catch Loki by the tail twice in a row. However, they all managed to escape by relying on illusions and cunning. After that, SHIELD was unable to detect any further fluctuations. This led Nick Fury to wonder if Loki had used the Tesseract to teleport away from Earth. However, Bruce Banner sought Tony's help again. The two geniuses worked together to improve the tracking program. It was discovered immediately. During this period, a completely new type of spatial fluctuation signal suddenly appeared all over the world. Moreover, these fluctuations occur without any pattern. It's like a mischievous child with spatial powers, casually poking around with his finger outside the world. This discovery immediately made the two realize that something terrible might be about to happen. However, before the two could inform SHIELD of this news, Luca called. This is why Tony rushed over so quickly after hearing about the visitors from another world. Upon hearing this, Luca immediately felt a headache coming on. What is this, a global invasion? It's more like Hydra is behind this. No, that guy who was blowing up his eyes was definitely a Hydra agent, wasn't he? At this moment, Luca, whose mind was a complete mess, was already regretting getting involved in this mess. He had originally thought that by showing his face in front of these superheroes, he could avoid any trouble from Hydra, since his family was already entangled with them anyway. At least there's a basic level of goodwill, so I won't be dragged into it too deeply. Now it seems that with my small arms and legs, gaining favor isn't an easy task. So according to you, the world is now full of Gwen and otherworldly invaders. I'm not an intruder, I just want to go back to my original world, Gwen muttered softly. However, Luca didn't have time to pay attention to his choice of words at the moment, and just stared straight at Tony Stark, who was speaking. Fortunately, Tony gave a negative answer. No, although we haven't found a pattern to this fluctuation yet, we can at least be sure that it doesn't exist specifically to summon visitors from other worlds. Besides people, it could be animals or objects, but most spatial fluctuations are just simple fluctuations and don't bring anything. At this moment, Dr. Banner spoke up, quite inappropriately. It could also be a virus. Seeing that everyone was looking at him, Dr. Banner shrugged innocently. As you know, no one can guarantee that people in parallel universes will experience the exact same viruses as those we have. Without antibodies that have evolved over hundreds of years, a simple flu virus from another world could wipe out our world. Upon hearing this, the others immediately felt a chill run down their spines. Samira carefully stepped back a few paces from Gwen, and even tried to gently pull her young master away. Luca, who was closest to Gwen, didn't seem panicked at all. As for why I'm not afraid, Marvel's writers probably don't have that kind of brain. So many aliens and otherworldly beings have come and gone, and I've never heard of any of them bringing a virus due to differences in physical constitution. Of course, this is just thinking about it. The fact that Gwen is safe doesn't mean that other visitors from other worlds aren't in danger. If a zombie from the universe were to accidentally fall out of the spatial fluctuations, this world would probably be doomed in no time. After temporarily setting aside this topic, Tony Stark looked back at Luca and continued. Although the spatial fluctuations appear without any pattern, according to our detection, the fluctuations in New York are particularly frequent. Moreover, the most central location is the experimental base left behind by Kingpin, which you mentioned. End of this chapter, Chapter 95, he said he would take responsibility for me. Chapter 95, he said he would take responsibility for me. 5th update. Having already heard this, Luca knew that Tony would definitely inform SHIELD about such a major event. Or perhaps he had already notified Nick Fury on his way here. It's unclear whether Tony Stark only mentioned the spatial fluctuations or also informed SHIELD about his own existence. Thinking of this, Luca abandoned his previous caution and asked directly, "So, what do you plan to do with me and Gwen?" By saying this, Luca was essentially placing himself on the same level as Gwen, indicating his willingness to participate in the matter. However, after hearing this, Tony gave him a deep look, then relaxed and casually offered 2 choices. Actually, this matter doesn't have much to do with you. Miss Gwen will definitely stay here to cooperate with us in some tests, which is also so that we can find a way to send her back to her original world later. But if you choose to go back, I will send a Mark Armor unit to protect your safety and keep in touch with you at all times. If you're worried about safety and want to stay here, that's fine too. But if I were you, I would definitely choose to go home obediently. You know, when I was your age, I was a well-behaved child, and I wished I could stay in the lab 24 hours a day. People like us only need to use our brains. There's absolutely no need to put ourselves in danger. When Dr. Banner, who was standing next to Tony, heard Tony's words, his face was filled with disbelief and a blank expression. When Tony said those words, he was thinking about the scene during the Battle of New York when Luca came to his aid. Even now, he still can't figure out why Luca would run out of his house and end up in that location when there were alien invaders everywhere outside. However, Tony always felt that this kid had a bit of a crazy side to him. So while Tony was verbally advising Luca to go home obediently, What he was actually thinking was something else entirely. It's better to keep him around. Otherwise, he might run off and get into some danger again. Luca, of course, couldn't guess Tony's true thoughts, but he didn't take Tony's subsequent incoherent advice to heart. He would make his own judgment on what choice to make. But before that, there are a few things Luca needs to figure out. Mr. Stark, how long do you think it will take to fully resolve this incident? Seeing that Luca did not make a decision immediately, Tony did not urge him, but spoke very patiently. Actually, before you arrived, someone had already gone to investigate Kingpin's experimental base, and also that sewer you mentioned. However, although there are some traces left in both places, there are no important discoveries. Moreover, it's hard to say whether the spatial fluctuations, Loki, and the mysterious force you mentioned are truly connected. So, I can't be sure how long it will take to resolve this matter, or whether you will be safe after it's resolved. At this point, Tony himself felt a little ashamed. For someone as great as Tony Stark, the famous Iron Man, to say something like hard to say or uncertain sounds incredibly degrading. After thinking for a moment, he decisively added another sentence. But don't worry, since you've been dragged into this, I'll definitely take full responsibility and ensure your safety afterwards. This is the first time a man has said he would take full responsibility for me. Shaking off the complaints in his head, Luca gave his own answer. Since Mr. Stark doesn't mind, I'll stay here for a few more days. If this matter can be resolved as soon as possible, that would be best. If it drags on for too long, then we'll talk about it later. However, if possible, could you please send a suit of armor to protect my home? I'm worried that if those people can't find this place, they might attack my family. Upon hearing Luca's words, Gwen, who had remained mostly silent until now, immediately added, "And my home in this world, they know nothing about me, and I don't want to drag them down because of me. Don't worry, Stacy's family has already sent people to protect her secretly. As for your request," Tony said, glancing at Luca, whose expression hadn't changed much, with a hint of boredom. "That's no problem. Having discussed this matter, it seems that everything has already been resolved." Luca and the other two all breathed a sigh of relief. Luca managed to ensure his own safety while successfully infiltrating the side of justice, thus distancing himself as much as possible from Hydra, which was bound to cause trouble in the future. Gwen saw hope of returning to her original world, and for now she had Luca, a familiar face, by her side. Samira believes that Luca and his wife are safe. Everyone has a bright future. Luca then turned to Samira and said something. "Aunt Samira, why don't you go back to the villa first? I need you to keep an eye on my mother for me." As he said this, Luca kept giving Samira meaningful glances. In fact, it's not just her mother Gina who needs her help. Samira also needs to bring back the core of the spider armor with Dungeon and acquire 276 tons of metal scrap. Fortunately, Samira understood Luca's expression, though she was somewhat worried about his safety. However, considering that this was Tony Stark's territory, there was no way he could encounter any danger, so he agreed after some hesitation. "Mr. Stark, I don't care, you can arrange this yourself." "No, I meant, do you have any spare labs that I could borrow?" After briefly instructing Jarvis to arrange a resting place for Luca in the building, there was no such place in the laboratory. According to Tony Stark, the top-floor laboratory has everything one could want, with complete materials and equipment. He can also give Luca pointers on whatever he wants to do at any time. After saying that, Tony took Dr. Banner with him to do some simple tests on Gwen. However, this is a bit awkward, although Luca does have some ideas and wants to create something for self-defense. However, his practical skills, "Never mind, hello will save me." As he spoke, Luca hugged the little creature in his arms even tighter. However, after telling Jarvis what materials he needed, Luca didn't just sit by the lab bench waiting. Instead, he tiptoed over to Thor, who was also unable to participate in the experiment and was dozing off on the sofa, and whispered something to him. "Sir Saul, may I take a look at your umbrella?" End of this chapter, Chapter 96, Thor &-039, S Hammer. No, the hammer of the puzzle. Chapter 96, Thor's Hammer? No, the hammer of the puzzle. May I take a look at this umbrella? Luca pointed to a black umbrella, leaning against the sofa next to Thor, and asked, feigning embarrassment. Thor, who was already feeling a bit bored because he couldn't help, immediately turned to look at Luca, a strange look in his eyes. Kid, what do you want to see it for? After saying that, without waiting for Luca's reply, Thor picked up the black umbrella next to him and slammed it into the ground. But whatever you're trying to do, you've come to the wrong place. Mjolnir isn't an umbrella. As he spoke, a flash of lightning suddenly appeared where the tip of the umbrella was pointing towards the ground. In the blink of an eye, the original black umbrella had transformed back into Thor's hammer. Seeing Luca's stunned expression, he was just pretending, Thor immediately grinned. He casually tossed the hammer into the air, caught it again, and asked the question once more. So, do you still want to watch it now? In fact, Thor's feelings towards Luca were quite positive. Previously, Luca did not choose to flee home, but stayed on this battlefield, ready to fight at any time. In the eyes of an Asgardian warrior like Thor, this was a display of masculinity. In addition, Luca's youthful appearance of only 14 years old is extremely deceptive. At this point, the question was asked more out of a desire to amuse the child. To everyone's surprise, after hearing Thor's question, Luca answered without saying a word. Miss you. These words stunned Thor. However, before he could react, the thunder noise had already caught the attention of Tony and the others. Thor, what are you doing? Upon hearing Dr. Banner's question, Thor replied without turning his head. This kid wants to see Mjolnir. You guys go about your business and don't worry about me. That being said, but Tony and Banner didn't continue working. Instead, they became even more curious and crowded around. Thor didn't mind and simply put Mjolnir back on the table, speaking to Luca with a hint of teasing in his voice. See, if you can lift it up, I'll give you something nice. This guy was probably bored out of his mind, so he leaned back and sat back on the sofa, waiting for Luca's next move. Luca, of course, wouldn't stand on ceremony with the other party. He walked to the table, first placing Haro, whom he was holding, at his feet, and then directly reached out and grasped Thor's hammer. The next moment, a light blue-gold finger panel popped up. 3D Puzzle Hammer. Doraemon World 1/5. Manufacturer, 22nd Century Technology Company. Core component, Thor's hammer. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 1, Chinese letter, 1000, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, 1, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Item description: a children's toy manufactured by a 22nd Century Technology Company. The number of puzzle pieces can be adjusted using a knob, from a minimum of 2 pieces to a maximum of 1000 pieces. After adjustment, tapping any object will transform that object into a 3D plastic puzzle piece of the corresponding number of pieces. The disassembled 3D puzzle piece will retain all properties of the original object except for its color. Only after the puzzle is completed will it revert to its original form. Friendly reminder: the disassembled puzzle pieces can be preserved for a long time and are easy to carry. Even liquids will be transformed into plastic. Of course, if your target is defenses or people, it will also be an excellent weapon of destruction. Yes, Luca's desire to see the black umbrella wasn't out of curiosity. Having seen the movie, he already knew it was Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, in disguise. There's only one reason why Luca wants to touch something. The prop is glowing. In fact, it's not just Thor's hammer. As soon as Luca entered, he saw several glowing props. However, those things were either the reactor in Tony's chest or the corner of Dr. Banner's underwear peeking out from his waist. It was really inconvenient for Luca to ask about such personal items. You can't exactly ask Dr. Banner, "I want to touch your underwear, can you?" In the end, all they could aim at was Thor's hammer. However, upon seeing this, Luca's mouth practically watered. It's a gadget from Doraemon. Although many of the high-tech gadgets synthesized by Luca's cheat code are black and make no sense at all. Even among so many worlds filled with high-tech gadgets, the Doraemon world is definitely among the most dark. Luca had no recollection of this prop, which was called the 3D puzzle hammer. However, just looking at the item description, it is definitely not an ordinary item. From an ordinary person's perspective, the original Thor's hammer was indeed dead if you hit it, and injured if you bump into it. But compared to the 3D puzzle hammer, with this thing, wouldn't I just tap Thanos and he'd be turned into a puzzle piece? At this moment, Luca's mind was already filled with the image of himself gently tapping Thanos, causing him to shatter into pieces. Forget Thanos, even someone of Doraemon's caliber would probably shatter the Infinity Stones with a single tap, right? Or rather, could he just tap the Earth? However, ideals are beautiful. The reality is that Mjolnir is more important to Thor than his own life. Thor wouldn't even flinch if he lost an eye, but without Mjolnir, he might be crying and ready to beat Luca to death at the same time. This made Luca, who had only come out of curiosity to touch Thor's hammer, somewhat reluctant to let go. This letting go might be a final farewell. While reluctantly touching the hammer handle, Luca's mind raced. Robbing them by force is definitely out of the question, but what about stealing them? I glanced at the panel again. The materials for this 3D puzzle hammer are surprisingly simple. Luca can be carried with him at all times. If we get the chance, should we draw the magic circle around the hammer when Thor isn't looking? Once the crafting is complete and the hammer disappears, who can find me? That won't work either. This world has magic. Even if you can evade the surveillance, you might not be able to escape Heimdall's eyes. But what if Thor himself doesn't want it anymore? As far as I can remember, after Mjolnir was crushed by Thor's sister Hela, it wasn't actually completely destroyed. After the battle with Thanos, Thor's hammer was reassembled and ended up in the hands of Thor's ex-girlfriend Jane Foster, who became the female Thor. During this time, no one, including Thor, paid any more attention to the damaged Mjolnir. I just wonder, once this core component is shattered into pieces, can it still be reassembled? Wait a minute. The reason this hammer can be assembled into a 3D jigsaw puzzle hammer isn't because it's destined to be disassembled and reassembled, is it? End of this chapter, Chapter 97 Hammer and Arm. Chapter 97 Hammer and Arm, second update. Luca, while holding Thor's hammer, was thinking about how to secretly get his hands on it. But Saul couldn't stand it. Whether he was worried about his precious hammer or simply felt that Luca was dawdling too much, he simply urged him on. "Hey kid, are you going to get it up or not?" As soon as he said this, the other humans who were watching the spectacle immediately gave Luca strange looks. Tony Stark then laughed and added, "Little pencil, if you can't lift it, then Uncle Tony will have to do it, Tilda." As he spoke, Tony actually took a few steps forward, clearly having long been curious about Thor's hammer. But since things had come to this point, Luca couldn't just give up his position, so he decisively stopped him. "Wait, you guys should get back to your business. I'm just about to get started." As he spoke, Luca rolled up his sleeves, revealing his mechanical arm, and struck a pose as if he were putting in force. However, he naturally understood the wonders of Thor's hammer. Odin, the king of the gods, had long ago cast a spell on it, and only those who were qualified could lift it and obtain the power of Thor. Luca doesn't believe he has Captain America's noble qualities, so he naturally wants to take a different approach and do some crooked things. Luca remembered that in his previous life, people had discussed that although Thor's hammer was something that unqualified people could not lift, it could still move up and down as easily as an elevator, a machine without any thought, without damaging it. The Tuxedo was meant to stimulate my muscles to move on their own, but I doubt it's very effective. But if I weren't the one lifting Thor's hammer, and the mechanical arm just moved on its own, wouldn't it be able to lift it? Do it when you think of it. Luca braced his elbow against the table for leverage. His whole body relaxed, except for his right mechanical arm, which gripped Thor's hammer handle tightly in a posture similar to an arm wrestling match. He then immediately activated Sweet Captive's healing ability. It's important to know that when the healing ability is activated, the transmission joints inside this robotic arm will move uncontrollably on their own. Immediately, a faint clicking sound came from Luca's arm. At this moment, everyone focused their attention on Luca's movements. The next moment, sure enough, Thor's hammer trembled slightly as if it had been pushed. However, before Luca could even show a look of surprise on his face, Thor's hammer, which was originally as light as a feather, suddenly became as immovable as a mountain. Luca suddenly felt a weight on his hand. Then came a click. The robotic arm failed to move the hammer. Instead, due to the reaction force of the transmission rod, it instantly embedded itself into the tabletop. The entire glass coffee table shattered instantly. Glass shards scattered across the floor with a crackling sound. Luca stumbled and fell, and Haro followed suit. However, Thor's hammer, which was originally placed on the table, did not fall to the ground. Instead, it floated in the air and shook its handle on its own. It was as if they were mocking Luca's overestimation of his abilities. It was only at this moment that Luca realized what was happening. Yes, although it's a hammer, Mjolnir actually has its own consciousness. Even if it manages to bypass the first detection, the hammer itself can easily refuse to be picked up by me. What Luca didn't know was that he had just witnessed Luca making his precious hammer tremble slightly. Thor's heart pounded with tension, and cold sweat broke out on his back. Fortunately, Mjolnir pulled through in the end, preventing him from losing face. Thor reached out and pulled Mjolnir back into his hand, then grinned at Luca. "How about it, kid? Want to try again?" However, Luca did not immediately answer Thor's question. Instead, looking at the broken glass on the ground, he politely addressed Tony, who was watching the scene unfold. "Excuse me, Mr. Stark, your desk." He was only halfway through his sentence when Tony Stark interrupted him, waving his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that, but..." "Luca, kid, where's the arm I gave you?" As he spoke, Tony's gaze remained fixed on Lucan's still trembling mechanical arm, a strange expression on his face. Although the arm given to Luca at the time did not utilize any particularly advanced technology. However, considering that young Luca might be more concerned about his appearance, Tony put a lot of effort into making the robotic arm indistinguishable from a real arm. Who would have thought that, instead of using his own realistic arm, this guy somehow got hold of a brand new robotic arm? Although it doesn't look as good as the one I made, it's not too bad either. Why did they add so many fancy features? And it even glows green. Does this kid have some kind of Chunibyo, middle school syndrome, disorder? At this point, Tony's mind had already drifted to the aesthetics of young people. Gwen, on the other hand, blushed and turned her head away when she saw Luca's mechanical arm shaking back and forth. Upon hearing this, Luca's face showed a hint of embarrassment. "Arm, isn't that it?" The mechanical arm Tony gave him had long been used by Luca as material for Sweet Captive, so it was naturally impossible for him to take it out now. "I could only come up with a random reason. The arm Mr. Stark gave me is very useful. However, I was very curious about the structure of the arm, so I disassembled it completely according to the information you gave me, and then made some minor modifications to remake this new arm." Upon hearing this, not only Tony but also Dr. Banner, who was standing nearby, cast curious glances at him. Tony had mentioned to him before that this boy named Luca seemed to be a promising talent. However, to be able to create such an exquisite robotic arm at such a young age is not only an achievement in mechanical engineering, but also suggests a considerable understanding of neuroscience and electronic information technology. At this moment, Luca also noticed the curious look in Dr. Banner's eyes. Fearing he would continue to press her about the robotic arm, she decisively changed the subject and spoke to Thor. "Mr. Thor, could I try your hammer one more time?" As soon as Luca said that, everyone's attention was drawn back to the hammer. However, at this point, Thor was already somewhat reluctant to let the kid try again, in case he actually managed to pick it up. However, out of pride, he had no choice but to pretend to be indifferent, casually putting the hammer back on the ground and turning to Tony and the others. "Feel free to try it. If you'd like, you can give it a try too." However, as soon as he said this, a sly glint flashed in Luca's eyes. He immediately gave the order to Haro, who had been playing dead since entering the room. Hello, why don't you give it a try? End of this chapter, Chapter 98 Thor Haro. Chapter 98 Thor Haro, third update, Luca gave the order. Haro, who had originally disguised himself as an adorable orange ball, suddenly had a red light flash in his eyes. At the same time, the pair of wing-like hatches on his head opened, revealing a pair of small mechanical arms. It hopped and skipped to the side of Thor's hammer. The electronic voice coming from his mouth was also very lively, encouraging himself. Hello, attack, hello, attack. Everyone froze in place. Among those present, even Gwen, who had been defeated by Haro before, had never actually seen Haro move. At this moment, I was naturally filled with questions. Actually, when Luca brought Haro in, Tony Stark had been curious about what exactly was in Luca's hands. However, due to his pride, he refrained from asking the question. It's even less likely that Jarvis would be allowed to directly scan and analyze, thus uncovering other people's privacy. However, what we see now is this seemingly small robot that not only possesses considerable intelligence, but also has very strange materials. It has a metallic sheen, yet it bounces and hops like a ball. The thirst for knowledge he had been suppressing finally became uncontrollable. He immediately shouted at the ceiling. Jarvis, analyze this little thing. Good, sir. Upon receiving the order, Jarvis immediately began scanning. Well, in reality, most scanning is actually done silently. It's relatively rare to see something like Baymax, which emits red and green light from its eyes during scanning. In just a moment, Jarvis's voice broadcast provided the answer. A small pet robot, made of unknown materials, was detected with carbon atom arrangement. The target possesses advanced artificial intelligence and has denied my network connection access. At the same time, Haro, who had already jumped next to Thor's hammer, also changed his voice. Data intrusion detected. Data intrusion detected. Now it was Tony's turn to be embarrassed. He immediately issued a new order. Jarvis, stop the data connection. After he finished speaking, he turned to look at Luca, as if to defend himself. You heard it yourself. I just asked Jarvis to analyze it, as for the intrusion. Seeing this, Luca smiled indifferently and shook his head, simply saying, Hello is more than just an electronic pet. In fact, Jarvis's behavior is entirely driven by Tony Stark's daily actions. Tony probably didn't realize at first what an important robot Haro was, which is why he casually ordered the analysis. Unexpectedly, Jarvis, which he was so proud of, failed to infiltrate the Haro system instantly. After realizing that this little guy was no ordinary person, it was already too late to make amends. However, Luca didn't really care about this. All the Gundam data stored in Haro's body was stored by physically disconnecting from the internet. As for the surface-level intelligent system, it is governed by the zeroth law, meaning that even if it is hacked and controlled, it cannot betray itself. Moreover, it seems that even with Tony's skills, it wouldn't be easy to silently hack into Haro's internal programs. While talking, Harona's short-armed mechanical arm had already grasped Mjolnir's hammer handle. Thor wanted to stop him, but before he could think of anything to say, he was already in a hurry. Thor's hammer was already being lifted up by Haro, who was so adorable. Sure enough, even with its own intelligence, the hammer doesn't seem to mind being lifted by this little guy. In fact, Luca had already guessed this after the robotic arm was able to move the hammer slightly. According to Mjolnir, moving a hammer with a mechanical object is no different from placing it on an elevator or the seat of a moving car. It was only because of its own existence that the hammer was judged a second time to have been picked up by someone who was not qualified, and it immediately became extremely heavy. However, this also seems to imply that Haro doesn't possess artificial intelligence at the level of mechanical lifeforms. Luca was still thinking about these trivial details. But Thor looked miserable. Looking at the orange toy ball, it wobbled and held its precious hammer high, opening its mouth several times, but could only babble a ba without knowing what to say. However, the 00 version of Hello itself does not have feet. It moves entirely by hopping and rolling its body. Even now, wielding Thor's hammer, which is as light as a feather, he still wobbles precariously, looking utterly comical. And coincidentally, there was one person present who didn't mind laughing at others at all. PFFD tilde hahaha tilde. Tony burst out laughing, patting Dr. Banner on the shoulder with one hand and pointing at Haro on the ground with the other, praising him. Hahaha, a new Thor has been born. Thor, didn't you say that whoever lifts the hammer will become the king of Asgard? As he spoke, Tony exaggeratedly struck a pose, as if welcoming a new king to the throne, then waved his hand and continued to laugh unrestrainedly. From now on, you'll play the lead role in Point Breaker, and let this orange-clad Thor rule the great Asgard. Listening to Tony's rapid-fire rant, Thor's face turned almost liver-colored. However, it's unclear whether it sensed its owner's embarrassment. Mjolnir, who had been letting Haro hold him and swing him around, suddenly jerked and broke free from Haro's mechanical hand. Then, the hammer body suddenly flipped in midair. Just like playing golf, it directly sent its temporary master flying. Haro's flight path, which was sent flying by the hammer, coincidentally aimed directly at Tony Stark, who was still there mocking Thor. A muffled thud. Stark's laughter stopped abruptly. He probably never imagined that, after the orange cannonball Thor ascended to the throne, the first opponent he would eliminate would be him, the loyal minister who supported his ascension. Sigh tilde tilde. Tony collapsed to the ground, clutching his stomach and groaning in pain. Gwen, who was quick-witted and agile, swiftly helped Tony up and checked on him with concern. But Dr. Banner, who was closer to Tony, completely ignored his teammate. Being able to hold back his laughter is already the greatest respect he can show to his sugar daddy. Thor, also an Avenger, was now laughing so hard he was doubled over. The tables had turned. Hahaha, Mjolnir tilde well done. Looking at these irresponsible superheroes, Gwen felt that her hope of returning to her original world was even slimmer. Luca, who met her gaze, simply shrugged indifferently. He spoke, summoning Haro back. Hello, come back tilde. Hello attack, hello attack. After rubbing the little guy, Luca asked Thor, who was still laughing hysterically. Mr. Saul, you just said you'd give me a gift if I could lift the hammer. I wonder if this little guy lifting it counts. End of this chapter. Chapter 99, How long did Einstein sleep? Chapter 99, How long did Einstein sleep? Fourth update, the farce ended, and everyone went back to work. The reason the atmosphere was relatively relaxed before was that the incident had not yet revealed any serious harm. The program for detecting fluctuations in the search space has been set up. If any new changes occur, Jarvis will definitely notify Tony immediately. The reason Tony and Dr. Banner were so busy so late was mainly because they wanted to give Gwen, this visitor from another world, a medical checkup. They wanted to see if they could find a way to locate other visitors from other worlds from her, and how to send her back to her original world. As for the task of tracking down the mysterious force that Luca and Gwen encountered, which is suspected to be related to this incident, it will mostly rely on the large number of people at SHIELD. However, once Luca heard that it was going to be done through SHIELD, he immediately lost hope that they could find out anything. Fine, it's better if they can't find anything. Anyway, I've already told Tony about the extremis virus test subjects and cyborgs. Once they make some noise on their end, Hydra probably won't be paying attention to a nobody like me anymore. Luca's current plan is to stay with Stark for a few days, building up his goodwill while waiting for the storm to pass. As for whether they can find anything in the end, with the Avengers and SHIELD all mobilized, they can't possibly be unable to handle such a small matter, can they? Luca had also wondered why the Ancient Ones seemed to have no reaction to this parallel world invasion. But he's just a normal person and can't remember the address of the New York sanctum from the original story. I secretly cursed Goo a couple of times, but I didn't see a golden halo appear behind me or my head being pressed against the keyboard. So I simply stopped worrying about it. Fortunately, by taking advantage of his connection with Stark, Luca can also utilize his resources to try and accomplish things that were previously impossible. Oh right, there's one more thing. Thor had previously said he would give Luca a gift if he could lift Thor's hammer. Although Thor only thought that Luca couldn't possibly lift it, that's why he said that later. But even though in the end only Haro lifted Thor's hammer, he did not deny it. Especially after Tony's stomach pain subsided, he also tried it out. When the hammer didn't budge, Thor laughed at Tony while promising that the gifts he would receive would definitely satisfy Luca. If he wasn't satisfied, he would secretly take Luca to his father's treasury and pick out any item. However, he is now stranded on Earth and is penniless. Aside from his own hammer, his daily meals and drinks were all provided by SHIELD, so he really didn't have anything worthwhile to offer as a gift. What Luca actually wanted to say was, "Just give me the hammer, I won't mind." However, he was afraid of getting beaten up, so he simply didn't say it. After finishing all that, Luca pretended to watch Tony and Dr. Banner for a while before going to rest. After eating and sleeping well and recovering my energy, I returned to the top-floor laboratory. It was already the morning of the next day. Upon entering, Luca only saw Tony Stark making a phone call in the lab. I suppose everyone else has gone to rest as well. Tony didn't deliberately turn his back on Luca. He simply gestured for him not to come in yet, and then continued talking to the person on the other end of the video call. In short, I don't need your people here. Although I haven't detected any new spatial fluctuations yet, Banner is enough for me. Your intelligence won't be of much help anyway. All right, let me know if you find any enemies or other visitors from another world later. I told you Spider Sister is mine now. Okay, that's all. After saying that, Stark raised his hand and made a shooting motion. He immediately threw the virtual projection in front of him into the recycling bin. After doing all this, he turned back to Luca and greeted him. "Hey, father of Thor, how did you sleep last night?" Upon hearing this strangely added nickname, Luca's face darkened as he was about to speak. "Good heavens, you're not scared at all, but I'm afraid Odin will come and beat me up." However, Haro, who was beside him, didn't care about all that and immediately jumped up and down excitedly. "For the glory of the god of the north, for the glory of the god of the north." This scene made Tony burst into laughter again. Speechless, Luca kicked the little thing, which resulted in a series of rocket headbutts. Then, he pointed to the location of the virtual projection and asked casually, "Was the person you just spoke to the head of SHIELD that you were talking about?" Yes, although Luca was quite far away and not in the frame, he still saw Nick Fury's dark-skinned face on the virtual projection. However, perhaps because Tony was wearing headphones and on the phone, Luca could only see Nick Fury's mouth moving on the screen, but he couldn't hear any sound. Upon hearing this, Tony merely shrugged and said casually, "That's right, it's that braised egg. Oh, braised egg is a Chinese delicacy. You can try it if you have the chance." Luca. However, Tony clearly didn't want to talk much about SHIELD, and after making that casual remark, he didn't intend to elaborate further. However, after thinking about it, he still added a sentence. "Don't worry, we haven't told them much about your situation. As for your identity here, well." As he spoke, Tony gestured with his chin, indicating that Luca should look at the table beside him. There was a temporary visitor pass there, printed out at some unknown time. Luca's lips twitched slightly upon seeing this. These kinds of temporary visitors definitely need to be recorded. It seems like they're more noticeable. Whatever. Luca casually stuffed his visitor pass into his pocket, then looked at the somewhat empty laboratory and asked curiously, "Mr. Stark, you didn't sleep all night, did you?" Upon hearing Luca's question, Tony raised an eyebrow indifferently. He scooped up the orange hello that was bouncing around at his feet, and then started playing with it while saying this. "Kid, Einstein only slept 3 hours a year. Look at his achievements." A year, are you sure?" It's 3 hours a day." However, at this moment, Jarvis spoke up without any courtesy. "Sir, according to the data, Einstein was a very famous long sleeper, sleeping more than 10 hours a day." "You shut up." Tony, somewhat embarrassed and angry, glared at Luca, took a few breaths to calm himself down, and then spoke again. "The materials you need are all over there. Go take a look." End of this chapter. Chapter 100. Tony, who practices Wing Chun, Luca and #039's new creation. Chapter 100 Tony, who practices Wing Chun, Luca's new creation, 5th update. Hearing this, Luca knew Tony was trying to change the subject. But not wanting to remain in his way any longer, she decisively took the hello from his hands and headed towards the workbench. To his surprise, just as he stood next to the workbench, Tony Stark, who was doing nothing, simply slid over on his wheeled chair. Seeing this, Luca was speechless for a moment. "Aren't you going to rest, Mr. Einstein?" In fact, Luca knew that at this time, Iron Man was having difficulty falling asleep normally due to anxiety symptoms following the Battle of New York. "The only way I can distract myself is by working a lot." So I just made a casual comment and then ignored the other person. Tony wasn't angry when he heard Luca's sarcastic remarks. He just rolled his eyes and continued to move closer. He said it in a very arrogant way. "I'm trying to give you some pointers. Most people don't have such a good learning opportunity." Upon hearing this, Luca's heart tightened, but he pretended to be nonchalant, gently tapping Haro's head beside him and giving a soft command. "Hello, connect the glasses. Connect the glasses, connect the glasses." Haro, bouncing around, had a red light flashing in his eyes, and a large amount of data immediately appeared on Luca's glasses. At this moment, Tony stopped looking at the very active Haro and instead stared with great interest at Lucan's shiny glasses. "Oh ho, Tilda, you made this yourself. A genius idea." In fact, Tony himself had similar ideas, but he has been busy with other things lately and has not yet put them into practice. Unexpectedly, I saw something similar in this kid in front of me. Can I borrow it to take a look? Intrigued, Tony decided to use the glasses to assess Luca's skill level and offer some guidance based on his own understanding. To everyone's surprise, Luca, who was sorting the materials there, didn't even look up and simply replied with a single sentence. "No borrowing." Tony, he never expected to receive such an answer. However, what he didn't know was that Luca was also in a panic. "Why do you have to look at tracking glasses?" You see, Luca is only able to pretend to follow instructions and complete the work by connecting to Haro using tracking glasses. For Luca, this was like a simplified operation guide for a building game. Once the glasses were in Tony's hands, he started playing with them. "It's all right if my work is suspended." But if Stark were to ask him any further questions, such as about the manufacturing process of the glasses, Luca would immediately be exposed. He couldn't just tell Stark directly in the end. "This isn't actually scientific manufacturing, it's alchemy. You draw a circle, bury some soil, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then pop, the finished product appears." However, Tony, who was being stubborn at the moment, was not angry after being rejected by Luca. I just felt that this fellow genius had his own pride. He immediately shifted his attention to the materials that Luca had categorized on the lab table. After a moment's thought, he spoke directly. "Are you planning to build a remotely controllable machine, a humanoid robot?" Upon hearing this, Luca turned back to look at Tony with a rather surprised expression. It's important to know that most of the things needed to be modified, and some were even handcrafted by him and Haro. Therefore, the materials in front of him were actually quite messy, lacking even the most basic mechanical framework or transmission device. If Stark's laboratory hadn't been so well equipped, Luca wouldn't have even considered this possibility. There is neither a framework nor blueprints at present. Tony actually guessed what I was thinking based on just that little bit of information. All I can say is, he truly is a genius. Seeing Luca's utterly astonished expression, Tony knew he had guessed correctly, and a smug look immediately appeared on his face as he decisively continued. "However, with these materials alone, it seems the robot you're planning to build won't have the ability to fly, right? Or have you already mastered anti-gravity technology? And are you even planning to create it by hand?" Upon hearing this, Luca's forehead veins throbbed. Actually, to be honest, he does have a gadget with anti-gravity capabilities, and he even wears it. However, the anti-gravity function on the Tuxedo is such a black technology that it's practically impossible to put into practice. Luca even used Haro and Baymax's combination technique to analyze it, but he couldn't find any anti-gravity components at all. But hearing Tony's slightly teasing question, Luca really wanted to press the switch and fly up to the ceiling to give him a fright. Quickly suppressing his impulse, Luca said with a dark face, "Will not." "What?" "I mean, I don't yet have the technology to make robots fly, so naturally the things I build aren't prepared for that. In fact, the most complete robotics technology that Luca currently possesses comes from Baymax. However, although Baymax's information is very complete, many of his props are labeled as purchased. Moreover, Baymax was not originally created for combat. Luca, of course, can only rely on Haro's internal Gundam data, auxiliary repair mecha data, and existing publicly available data in this world to make improvements and adjustments. This work has actually been ongoing and optimized by Luca and Haro ever since Luca developed Haro's manufacturing capabilities. Yes, Luca provides the ideas and approaches, and Haro uses his own knowledge to realize them for Luca. Everyone is indeed working together. However, neither Big White nor the maintenance mech has the ability to fly. The Zero Series Gundams rely entirely on the unscientific anti-gravity effect of the GN particle theory to fly. At present, Luca is indeed unable to create a robot with the ability to fly. However, Tony heard Luca say no. He was taken aback at first, then immediately burst into laughter. "Ha ha ha, no way. Ha 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 tilde, you're trying to make me laugh to death, aren't you? I thought you were going to come up with a helicopter propeller and mount it on the robot's head to make it fly. So you're saying you can't, ha 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 tilde tilde." Seeing Tony laughing so hard he was doubled over, Luca was speechless. He simply pointed and gave the order to Haro. "Hello, hit him." Upon receiving the order, Haro immediately became excited. "Hello, attack, hello, attack." He pressed his whole body downwards, squeezing himself into a small oval shape. He then leaped forward and rammed headfirst into Tony Stark. Result: Tony, who had been laughing happily, suddenly raised his hand quickly and drew a circle, catching Haro in his arms with ease. He looked at Luca with a mischievous grin and said, "Hey kid, Uncle Tony's a Wing Chun practitioner." End of this chapter. All right, legends, that's it for today. If you're ready for the next chapter, smash that like button and flood the comments right now. Remember, we've got 3 days to prove this story needs to continue. Subscribe so you don't miss the drop, and I'll meet you in the next audiobook.